we agree already that it's an emphasis problem, and that we both agree that they're both factors of analysis, the agent and nature, that you can't, one doesn't take over the other per se. Do we agree that they're both basically like factors with an emphasis problem?
And you want to start with if it's part of is agent and nature the same? I mean,
Not the same. Not the same per se.
No, I know that. I'm just working backwards from that. So the first question is, are they the same? Are they coincidental with each other? I mean, I would say no, they're not. That's the first one. And then the second act from there is then to ask, well, which one is there a priority of one to the other? Generally, no. And in fact, for me, it's a larger project that I'll have to work on later in my life. It's the nature of the exemplar is actually a moment of when the agent is the nature.
Yeah.
But that defeats the categories, or it subsumes those categorical, that distinction of agent versus nature. But it's very hard. That's a domain that Aristotle points to of basically the limit of his thought of his project. That's one of his limits, is that problem he cannot address the exemplar directly. Aquinas has notes about it as the exemplar cause, but that's where the problems start showing up. Is Aquinas tries to address things with exemplar causation, but then it's assumed just be collapsed into the mind of the agent. So thus, then you start seeing a trajectory of agency having priority over nature around that direction. That'd be my off the cuff read of that. So that's the first part. Everybody else, go.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Well, I might just some thoughts. So if I were, and please step in if I misframe this or different things. So there seems that the stakes of the question first seems to be if the agent has priority, then there's a risk of a certain arbitrariness, or the agent chooses, and then the agent is basically almost the first mover. You could almost say God. And then at that point, why wouldn't you have an eternal, or just a splintering off where there's no shared ground? Maybe there's no possibility of society. And if one agent chooses X, then by what basis could you say X is not fitting for that individual if they choose it? And what if that leads to power dynamics, violence, and all sorts of stuff? And isn't it at that point basically impossible to meaningfully talk about good, bad, ethic, anything regarding virtue? Seems like at that point it would be arbitrary, right? On the flip side, if you say that nature has the dominant role, then, do humans just exist to get out of the way? Of course, don't you have an interpretation problem? Who decides what take on nature is nature? And won't that simply be an agent in disguise claiming it's not an agent's choice? They're saying, no, it's nature, but really it's just an agent claiming it's nature to give it authority, and it's a power move, right? Almost in the same way that someone like a Foucault may say norms are just, power in disguise. Nature could be power in disguise, right? And also, who defines what is nature? Are cities part of nature? Or, is nature the forest? Is nature desire? Is, where does nature begin and where does nature end, right? Is there a sense in which whatever humans make part of nature? Are robots part of nature? Why not? And the reason why I say this is because if we ask questions about nature, well, then how do we define nature by which to say what is in accordance with nature and what is the unfolding of nature? Also, there is, of course, a question of freedom. If nature is dominant, are humans free? In what sense are we free? And also, in what sense can we talk about virtue if agents don't really have any, agency, right? What is virtue if agency is so weak that it's dominated by nature, that it's either, maybe it's something you're just born with the nature, you're born with the disposition, you're born with the genetics, et cetera, and so forth, right? Because there's also a weird thing where the word nature almost has two meanings, right? There's nature, and then there's nature as disposition, right? Do we really, if we say that agency, if there's not enough agency in the subject, then nature, our nature is just our disposition, and that would seem to be deterministic, and we wouldn't have any say on the matter, right? Now, I obviously know that many philosophers have worked in the between space of these works, but if we were to say what are the stakes of the problem, that might be some opening frames. Second to it as well, there is this weird problem of you go, okay, well, don't you ultimately have to choose if you even accept that framework, if you accept the terms of debate? And isn't that as an interpretive move in of itself meaning that the agent is first? Is there a difference between interpretation and choice? Are all choices the same? Are all actions equally subjective? Are all interpretations equally are some better than others, right? What's the difference between an interpretation that's arbitrary and an interpretation that's actually a participation? How do we tell those differences? How do we begin asking those questions? Obviously, there's a way more to say, but those, I suppose, I might just start as some of the stakes of it. If anyone disagrees or would like to add to that, those are just some opening thoughts.
I would like to add. So yeah, I love the way you're framing this, Daniel, because this is really showing a lot of the stakes of the issue. I'm going to make a weird connection here between like poetry, for example, like what makes good poetry, what constitutes good poetry. I don't know if you guys have read people like Rupi Kaur. She's more like a confessional poet. I think I was talking to Michael. He's like, oh, she's kind of like a postcard poet. Like it's very simple language. It's very confessional. So it's very interesting now is what we have is this phenomenon called Insta poets, where they write very simple, but a majority of them don't really read poetry. So you have people, but this is very interesting because you have people that are getting into poetry from writers that don't read poetry. So, but then, so I if I were to argue like a sympathetic case for them, it's like, well, how do you reach the people that don't read poetry? Well, writers that don't read poetry seem to have the knack for it. But then this problem of like, how did you frame it, Daniel? Like this abstruse case of ambiguity, particularity. And I was talking to my partner about this, about how do we know the difference of what makes a good poem and a bad poem? Because I feel like a lot of the subjective decision-making is actually involved in this. And I feel like a majority of when people talk about, oh, 1960s music is bad, to me, I think it's just like a category error. Like, basically, if you were an expert in 1960s music, and that was like your place, then you could tell me which song in the 1960s probably wasn't really good, because that just seems to be like your field. Whereas to say that 1960 music is just bad in comparison to this other, it's like, well, maybe, but there's a lot of ambiguity because now it's like, what kind of songs define the 1960s as 1960s? You would need somebody to talk to with that. So what I'm trying to get at is when we get to human decision making, I think there is a real sense in which there are bad choices and bad sense making. However, it's a debate, I think, between how far into are you in that mode of being. So basically, are you a beer connoisseur or are you just a guy that enjoys Bud Light? If you're just a guy that enjoys Bud Light, you can't really tell me anything about beer. And I think this is when we're kind of getting at the exemplar example, because I feel like the more you spend time in that nature of beer, do you have an understanding or an appreciation of like what a good beer possibly tastes like, versus not. And I feel like only then can we really say to some degree, is there a bad tasting beer or a good tasting beer? And I feel like it just has to do with the fact that if you have the condition of appreciation already, then it makes possible to make determinations between what is good and what's bad, in a real kind of way. Because now it becomes debatable as to like all, the more you get deeper into it, like, it's like, do you like darker beers? And then like, what's a good dark beer? Like someone has to already have an appreciation for dark beer in order to tell you like, yeah, these dark beers will be good for beginners. Once you get more into it, you'll start appreciating these dark beers. or maybe you don't like dark beers. So it's very interesting how human subjectivity, the more it goes deeper into it, it's able to make decision making that actually makes sense, and it's not merely as subjective as we'd like to think it is. And I do think it actually kind of starts folding into where the human subject becomes the nature, like Jockin's talking about. Like it becomes the human exemplar of beer tasting. You know? But I'll just, those are my thoughts.
No, very good. I think, you know, anytime we can get into the question of the subjectivity of taste, right, and kind of addressing that's always an interesting point. I think, Javier, you're totally right about this idea of, ironically, when human beings get more experience, this is actually a property of phronesis. And specifically from that, you actually gain insight into finding the fitting account. So this leads to this, you know, an area of interest of mine is actually the perceptual power of nous, and individual human beings have that. And if nous is life, if life is the activity of the actuality of nous, that's actually very important, because actually, in one sense, that's beyond agents or entities, but yet partakes in them at the same time. And actually, on a note related to what you're bringing up, Javier, about this experience, persons with subjectivity of experience, basically, and it's inductive reasoning, by the way. This is Aristotle's notes about inductive reasoning. It's via the repetitional pattern of experience, something appears that's consistent in the difference, right? And you gain discernment of better and worse that's moving towards, right, a tendency. And that tends to be the case in most subjectivity, kind of aesthetic experiences. If you see any empirical studies on it, on any kind of any assessments of product of music or taste or objects on on either goodness or badness, defined as pleasure or visual interest or any other quality, they are generally population distributions. They have that property, which is perfectly fine. They're generally, and actually it's interesting, the formal shape of that populational statistic is actually an important aspect of finding out the more the truth within, of how good or bad it is under these qualifications. I say that because usually if it's not that good of an object, it has a very dispersive population. It's a very dispersed collection of data, very widely spread, a very, very shallow slope. So basically the mean of the central tendency tends to be very flat and very dispersed wide, versus more effective design projects or objects of aesthetic taste or experience are more concentrated with a higher peak in their average assessment of people reviewing it. So that points to say that, even as you're saying, Javier, that yes, generally, because if there is these patterns that are perceivable through empirical methods, that means there's something there. Now, it does take, with some caveats, it does take, is there an outlier that can look at a piece that almost everybody agrees is amazing, and they say, no, it sucks, or this isn't good, or I don't like this beer? You know, yes. No, actually, that's the case, but that's true in nature, too. Aristotle is very clear. The spontaneous and chance are still apply to nature. So even though there's this, nature works in tendencies, especially when it interacts with material objects. So as a result, these are perfectly normal properties to occur. Just because because, for example, any kind of any condition of lack, blindness, loss of limbs, that doesn't destroy nature by that fact. That's just that entity is just lacking. It has a lacking quality to that. So anyway, that's a nice part. I want to add a note from Aristotle about that, related to, it's really interesting about basically a good techne and a bad techne. Or better, actually, the language uses actually techne and the lack of techne. It has the negative, like basically lacking or absent, the absence of techne. They're both making, so they're both poetic activity. They're both productions, but a good techne, the presence of techne is when it's with truth. So this is usually, I don't like using that, but actually under this parameter of discussion is very important, because it actually says no. So technes, and of course the arts, the making of things, have techne. They're not just raw production, because they have truth, an aletheia revealed to it. So there's a kind of appearance that occurs of truth. versus when there's lacking of techne, it's making with falsity. And that actually relates to Daniel's comment about agents having freedoms that we can, without me, you do nothing. Meaning you're bringing forth falsity in your productions. So I'm just thinking about that kind of line, which is a very peculiar aspect. This is related to what Aristotle says with a rational activity. A rational activity does not have the force of necessity attached to it necessarily. Meaning, the common example always Aristotle gives is a rock is a rational activity because it only does one thing. It drops. It's not gonna all of a sudden decide, whoop, I'm going up this time instead. Versus rational activity like humans, we can basically, by our desire and choice, either do the action or not do the action. The example always is medicine. So when we have medical knowledge, we can choose to use it to heal, or we can choose, very importantly, to not just by not doing anything, basically abstain by omission of activity. We also can do the negative state. We can do the privational state, sickness, with that knowledge. So us, for human beings, that relates to both the privational of the principle of an activity, and also, I think with techne from Aristotle, we actually can do productions with falsity. That's actually very important. That means what it's getting at is that our phantasms, we can actually operate with the wrong phantasms. And actually that relates to phronesis. So there's a very deep, there's a relationship happening in Aristotle in artistic production with phronesis, which again, practical wisdom, the application of universals to a particular circumstance. And that it has an appearance of a techne as a production, when it relates to productions, making of things, generation of things that are external to the entity, that's from matter that's not the entity, when it's with truth. When it's with falsity, that's a lacking of techne and a failure of phronesis. Because normally that's almost because you knew you could in phronesis have a failure of wisdom, meaning you don't have the major premise, but most likely, more commonly, it's a failure in the minor premise, the application of the universal premise in the particular circumstance of how much, when, to whom, all these important details. So thus, that's why techne, basically people doing productions can produce failure, basically can make with failure, because their models in their heads are not corresponded to external reality. Versus with techne, there is correspondence, or there's kind of a correspondence relationship right there, related to the phantasms of the mind versus the activity, the production on the outside. Which is quite interesting, because that kind of points to a general instinct. But generally in the arts, we talked about this, like we're studies of nature, and that's actually very important details. Like what exactly are human beings doing in their productions of nature, working with nature? Generally, it's related to observation and looking for resemblances. That's basically what we're doing. So we're actually interacting with nature to perceive it, so that we can see the resemblances in nature, and then generate and use productional works to generate that. Basically, using guided by that. Yeah, I got more to say, but that's enough for now.
If we take, okay, we've talked enough where we know, like, for example, like beauty, how we have a pretty good sense of how each of us think of beauty, for example. Okay. What that means to me is, if you like techne, for example, it definitely deals with how, however you want to word it, but how we steer work, basically. Work being what we think, what we do with our hands, etc., etc. But in that dimension alone, it doesn't necessarily have anything articulating how it relates to the beautiful. And that, to me, is a good sign of how, like, this dichotomy doesn't necessarily, it hasn't been thought through fully. So I just want to, start off with that. When you think about it, I think the emphasis is on nature ultimately, but in an ironic way, that how we apply work needs to respect the mystery of nature. Now, that's how it's emphasizing nature first, but the emphasis of how we operate in time is always with how we understand the work, which is different than interpreting the work. So interpreting the work means, for example, you understand, not sorry, that different when you're about to do the work, you're trying to get a grasp of the context in which you're doing the work in. When you evaluate the context, trying to get an interpretation would mean that you understand it linearly, but you don't understand it in terms of how it relates to the mystery of how that individual context is related to the mystery of how the context basically is given to you. So being able to trace the human's job, the agent's job, in my mind, is to keep a strong relation between getting to the place of understanding why one is doing work in context, which means how to do work while maintaining the mystery of the context in which that work is situated in. So the emphasis on nature to me gets overblown when there's a and I've talked about this with Javier recently, and he actually really pushed back on me, like, in great ways, very personal. It's like, well, Luber, you got to choose, Dan, you got to choose, which I totally respect. And yeah, it's like, oh, you're being too much of a pussy. Just choose your religion, so to speak. And I get that. But here's my gripe with thinking about it I don't want to call it crude, because I think there's some truth. Absolutely, there's truth to what you're saying to me, Javier. I just think the problem with choosing in that fashion is that the mystery isn't as mysterious as it should be, where the emphasis is so heavily on nature that the agent gets overlooked in how it's supposed to maintain the work's understanding in the particular context in which it's in. So I think it's the move for me in the world that we're living in is to recognize that there's an emphasis on nature, and what that emphasis means is that it sparks the surprise that reveals a slew of different contexts, where in that slew you will be able to interpret all these different contexts, but only to arrive at an understanding by doing work in one of those contexts which you choose, and being able to do work in one of the contexts, so to speak, in which you're choosing, comes down to the fact that you're able to do work while maintaining the mystery of how that context even came about in the first place. That's one part of what I want to argue here today. The other part is because there's this, I want to talk about lack here. I think we're pretty much all on the same page with lack, okay? But I'm in a little bit of a recency bias because I'm just like talking Desmond a lot of Desmond influence here, okay? And I think he has an interesting pushback that I don't fully agree with, but it changed my stance here. In order to maintain the mystery, we have to see that the ontological ground that gives rise to all these different contexts in which we interpret from, it comes from this like porosity of being, this givenness of being, okay? Keeping that as the ontological ground will allow for lack to be seen ontologically, but only ontologically as it relates to whatever ground you're doing work in, essentially. That the lack is actually quite particular in terms of it's more relating to the work that you're doing, like personally, versus it being that initial light that gives rise to all these different contexts in which you're able to make interpretations about, and eventually, once you actually see a ground, one of the contexts in one of those contexts in which you're interpreting, when you experience or when you experience lack in one of the particular contexts, at that moment, that's when you're thrown into a work mode with that particular context, because you are like, you're binded by the lack that grounds your pathway of understanding your work. Now, please ask questions if I'm not, specific here in your mind, but I'll pass it off. But yeah. So thank you. Yeah.
Delightful. Well, I'll jump in. So there's a few things. First, when we talk about agent versus nature, there's some questions on is agent the best word? Because there's also an interesting thing where no human creates or works ex nihilo, right? All we ever do is move around what is given. So there's a way in which all we ever do is work with nature, right? There is no such thing as agency that is creating ex nihilo. So is agency even correctly the word contrasted with nature, right? Because agency only ever works with nature. And in that sense, the agent is made of nature, right? Now, also there are questions of, is nature a word that inherently entails a certain ethic in its very word? Because it implies a directionality, if you will, right? What's the difference between, what if we were to say agent versus environment? Isn't it funny how the word environment doesn't have the same sense of a direction, right? But if we say agent and nature, the language of agent suggests ex nihilo possibility, which we know is not the case unless you're God. And the word nature implies directionality already, right? Whereas perhaps the problem is that actually we don't find ourselves thrown in nature. We find ourselves thrown in an environment, and we have to do the work to make environment nature, per se, of which is possible because the environment entails nature in of itself latent, if we so realize it with our correct work, if you will, right? So perhaps there's something to be said that the problem is that the environment is not nature until we, well, rightly align with it, right? And that, now, again, another question is another word for agent might be subject. Well, what does a subject do? Well, a subject makes themselves subject to, right? I, as a subject, the choice I make is choose what I am subjected to, what I put myself under, right? If I were to say I choose to create something versus I choose to make myself the subject of some sort of mentor, perhaps nature, is that give us the same agency problems that we spoke of before, where the agency can create their world and then everything splinters off and subjectivity is God and society is doomed, right? If we suggest that there are subjects that can choose to make themselves the subject of an environment, and if done in the right way, it becomes a nature, but that word nature is fundamentally relational of the subject in relation to the environment, and the trajectory is the togetherness of them both, right? Is that going to give us the same problems of the human creating their own world and thinking of themselves God, etc., so forth? Or at this point, do we find a certain way to bring together the positions? If I were to speak of my own personal experience on different things, there's a weird way in which you want to get better at being shown. You want to get better at having things manifest to you. And suddenly, I think this aligns with what Jockin has said with Noose, but please push back if not. Getting better at things being apprehended in this very mysterious way, not working to a conclusion, but being able to apprehend things, right? When I was younger, you know, you feel as if you learn or your work is primarily seemingly more, it feels more will-based, right? You're choosing things, you feel like you're kind of in the driver's seat, things feel subjective, right? Where you're choosing, I like pizza versus, you know, kale or something, right? It feels as if you're making your own world, right? But there's something that starts to happen where as you get older, you also come to kind of realize, oh, that's kind of arbitrary. Oh, that's kind of empty. Other people do different things. And also, the longer you say, write a really bad science fiction series called The Sword of Tribulation and do that for a decade, eventually you start having things manifest more entire in your mind. Instead of it all being planned out, things start to kind of be entire. Say a short story like The Drunkard or Under the Wing or something like that. Bye, Luber. He's lacking now. So, you know, but eventually what happens is things appear to you. It's more like they just kind of manifest. And then at that point, you can choose to follow that or to continue doing the work on your Sword of Tribulation, right? And there's something about maturity, in my opinion, that starts to be you go in the direction of the thing you apprehend more than you plan, per se. The things that kind of appear versus the things you plan, because obviously I'm alluding to a preparation planning distinction we talk about all the time. And it could be argued that the only way you get to that place is because you almost climbed a ladder of being, almost, of doing your own work where you fill yourself with things where then something can start to be apprehended, per se. It's a different experience with the creative work with time. And then, of course, if you have that experience in yourself, you start kind of realizing, well, if this is possible here, why would it not be possible in the world? Why would it not be possible in relationships? Why would it not be possible in other environments, right? Because if it's possible there, it can occur everywhere. And what's very interesting for me, and I could put meat on these bones, but I'll pass, is there seemingly is a movement where what predominantly feels like agency, gradually that agency turns out to be that which leads you to this place where it's more of you become subject to versus subject over. And the subject over was simply leading you to the place where you could make sense of the subject to. And then mostly what you feel like you're doing is how do I arrange my environment so that they seem to have a kind of nature, I guess I want to say, right? You start reading books or having interactions to create these things that something can come forth from, right? As opposed to necessarily having a clear design. You're filling yourself, you're putting yourself in to where things can manifest. And I think, and can be apprehended. And I think what's very interesting about that experience is the subject then primarily has a role of, like I said, you become a subject of, you're more in a posture of waiting, right? Like you're designing your environments in a kind of waiting for something to be apprehended, for something to come forth. And at that point, it does not feel like it is just you, even though you're doing work. I think what ends up happening is so let me put it in this language. You seem when you're young to have this agent environment relationship, and you can stay there your entire life. You could die in that phase, and perhaps that's the modern world, right? You never get beyond an agent that has free choice, and free choice is God, and then we're all fragmented into oblivion, right? But if there's a certain maturity, I do want to say, then you move from being an agent to a subject, and you start learning that actually what you want to do is make yourself a subject too. And then the environment becomes, in a way, a nature where there are things that come forth more so than others, and that it's found in a certain relational contact where you're in a posture of receiving and waiting. But this waiting is not inactive because you actually have to put yourself in place. Because this may be, like, I think you become more of a designer. You become more architectural in your creation. But here's the trick. It does matter where you wait. Like waiting in church is different from waiting in your dorm room. waiting on the net or waiting here is different from waiting in the mall, right? This is very interesting because for me, if there's something about freedom, the role of freedom is to choose where you wait for something to come forth. But you see, the key to that is if something does come forth, you can't say it was a product of your freedom because all your freedom did was bring you to the place of the waiting, of being in a posture to receive, right? And you gradually then say, recognize patterns and learn what has a higher likelihood to surprise you, what has the probability of something coming forth versus not. But it's very interesting because it feels at that point inadequate to say that this is merely a product of your freedom or your personal choice, right? There's more to be said because then I could go into what I mean by the absolute choice, and how, you know, if you can end up by the birdie and donkey caught between two equal piles of grain and thus can't make a rational choice, well, nature has to be such where that could be the situation. So if you find yourself in an absolute choice, that is only afforded to you because reality is such to bring you to an absolute choice. So the absolute choice ends up being that which is ultimately only afforded because of something that is given to you, right? Now, that was a big thing I just added that would have to be expanded on. But those are some initial thoughts in response to some things that have been said.
Here, I'll jump in. So we'll start for Daniel. Great points. I want to talk to you about what you said in a minute. But Luber, this is the thing to clarify. So when you said work, so Aragon, which is where anageia comes from, there is a distinction in Aristotle because between activity and kinesis. So anageia and kinesis. So just to clarify. So for example, anageias are activities that are complete within themselves. They're actually atemporal in nature. Versus kinesis is temporal. Usually locomotion is the common example, or a change in quality. We would be examples of kinesis. A low overlap. If a change in substance, for example, is an anageia, or basically the enactment of a function that is the totality of the function. So, for example, when you're seeing. That's it. For Aristotle, that's the conclusion. This kind of leads a little bit to the praxis versus production distinction in ethics. A little bit in that thrust, you can take it that way to understand what Aristotle's getting at. It's just important because it does set up a little bit of a distinction of what you're saying. Because usually the agent is productions are always external to the agent, like under this language. That's the main distinction. Well, activity is with the as agent whole doing it. So just that's to clarify like what's going on there, or why I'm bringing this up. But with that said, yeah, your notes on the understanding versus the interpretation. Yeah, from Aquinas, the idea of discursive reason, which is in a sequential arrangement. Even things like inferencing of syllogisms require that. That's different from nous, or the acquisition of the archaic, the principle. And that's the point. You can and that's the thing. You can understand the extremes of the phenomenon, but if you don't have the principle to gather it all together, it's just you won't have it. You won't actually have understanding. You'll have interpretations. So actually, that's always why one of the ways I always talk about logos. That's interpretation. That's what it is. Because the same phenomenon can be told in totally different accounts. Those are logi. Right. Perfectly reason. That's a perfectly normal account. But actually, now we talk about lack at Luber. Lack is actually one of those examples of blowing up the agent-nature distinction. I'll tell you why. Because Aristotle has a very clear point about lack is always particular. Always individuated. Against their, like in the nature, like relative to the nature. So the example Aristotle gives is things like the personhood of Socrates is a kind of relationship to its to the nature of man, or the bronze. This in actually the language of Aristotle, this brazen sphere is in relationship to spherical, for example. So that'd be an example of it. So if an agent is always said to be a particular individual, and nature is just kind of universal. So this is part of the kind of built on Daniel's original context. This is important because it also relates to the problem of nominalism and realism in terms of what is the relationship of the universals to the particular. This is actually one of the ways that we could address it is using lack, by the way. So this is actually this is actually why, as a neo-realist, that's one of my strategies of why I'm doing this, is by the very, as you were saying, Luber, the very act of using Desmond kind of reading, which I'm not against, but I would just say, yeah, your approach of lack is actually showing you the sign that nature exists and that there's a connection.
Yeah.
And there must be, it's given to you. The lack is the presence in front of you that tell you that. And that's not in your head, dog. Like, that's not just a subjective preferencing. There's something really being presented to you. The other way to put it is that because the concept of development, the way a development of a living entity that changes over time makes any sense is not just because we're told that's the case. There has to be a real reality of connection, that the fetus becomes a child, a toddler, that becomes a child, that becomes an adult, right? The maturation period. That's development. That's from the form. That's from the eidos of the thing. But the point is, like, we can talk about it as you could use that in a language of lack, because, right, the baby, like, there's certain, and actually that's acknowledged that children, human beings, don't get their logos, access to logos until about 7. Aristotle's account of that, Islamic accounts have that same point. There's an acknowledgement of development that a human being is inherently lacking at its first development phase. And we know this because babies can't support themselves. They can't. Just nutritional, on their own nutritional, on the nutritive soul, they can't support themselves. But even the point of access to logos of the human being, that's a development in time. So on Daniel's point about maturation, that's built in as, that's definitely a reasonable account. And in fact, Aristotle's famous account on this is on a whole problem of political science, and probably for nieces in general, is that children can't do it. They can learn the abstractions they can do that because they get access to about age 7 onward. That's why we can teach third graders about geometry, the Pythagorean theorem, right? The theorems of Pythagoras and other geometric abstractions. We can teach them abstractions at pretty young ages, but the understand for nieces is a much harder difficulty, much more difficult, requires much for maturation. I do want to posit another answer, by the way, of what is the kind of things that could overcome or transform the apparent impulsive challenge of agent versus nature. I think Daniel's comments about environment and subject are very good. That's a very good way to talk about it. Another one I want to point out is life. Life's another one.
Yeah.
Life is actually does that instantaneously, because just like you hinted at, Daniel, where some agents use nature because they're not making ex nihilo. In the Islamic account, human beings are only fasteners. They're not the originator nor the creator.
Right.
So on that similar thrust of we're just using nature or using substance to generate other substances in a fashioning manner. Another way we can put this, where we're living, agents are living who use life or interact with life that's external to it. And that's the point. Life actually seems to have this quality of both individuation and relation and external other, and the relationship between the individual and the others in a relationship. So that's another aspect you can talk about in terms of approaching what agency is, or the relationship of agency and the nature, and then saying that any questions of supremacy can be overcome by discussions of lack, life, and probably nous too. Personal opinion. Those 3 are probably the ways you could address that. There's another note, by the way. It's on the exemplar angle. Is it John 14? I am the way, the truth, and the life. I just think that language in that case is just very particular. It's very interesting. And it actually relates to the question. I reread that section quickly. On the Jesus is supposedly leaving. He's going to be assumed. And Thomas, ironically, Thomas is asking, where are we going to, like, where am I going to go? What are we going to do? So it's kind of like, how do we going to orient ourselves with the loss of the source under their account? And that's Jesus' answer to them. I just think that's interesting, because this kind of language of a way of approach, of way of relationship, an orientation of truth, of revealing, and a life. I want to bring that. I was reminded of that. Daniel, your last note, I was wanting to do, Daniel, on this idea of a subject environment and nature, and the subject to versus subject over. Oh, this is excellent. This is Eros. This is exactly it. This is Eros. Uh, in my current, because that's the point, it's a relationship of desire. I want to add some notes from my current research I'm working on. Aristotle has the most fascinating answer in metaphysics. It's actually related to the use of geometry to talk about beauty and goodness. It's very interesting. But I'll just posit a note from it. He comments, because this is also really, because it's all, in my opinion, it confirms Plato's account of suggestion that there's a distinction or generative distinction between beauty and goodness. It's presented twice. It's in Greater Hippias and in Philebus, the same thrust of the line, that goodness's power comes from the nature of beauty. So that's also very interesting, because this now we're talking about this question of absolute forms here, not even about agency in of itself. So within the form domain, that one is coming from one's power and activity capacity is coming from the nature of something else. In this case, beauty. This is Aristotle's answer. Goodness is attached to motion, kinesis, activity, motion, and change. But beauty can be discussed in things that are not motions. What he's getting at is the idea of the prime mover that's unmoved. Like it's from the prime unmover that things if you have movement. It's actually, you could definitely see. I think it was the argument of desire proving God kind of orientation, that all things orient towards with desire towards their good. This thing, while analogical, is still a tendency all things relate to. And the thing that must cause that desire has to be a primary unmoved thing that is of necessity the case, not contingently. That's more of an Islamic point, that last one, but it gets used by Christians later. So that relates to goodness. So this motion of movement, right? And we saw that in Symposium, this motion of desire or possession to have of the beloved, that's goodness. But then the cause of that desire for goodness is beauty. So I just want to give a note about that, just a nice addendum to it. And that's all I got.
Yeah. Oh man. Jeez. So Daniel, I really like that you brought this up, this distinction between environment and nature. Because what's been coming to my mind, and well, one, I want to address Luber's idea about like seemingly to protect the mystery, because it's like it's already determination on the mystery that the mystery needs to be protected in such a way. Like to me, that already like carries an assumption in which, like to me, I would say like if it's a good story, then you're already going to forget. You're actually going to fall again. So is nature in such a way that we are supposed to forget, fall again, and then re-encounter mystery as a way to make beauty even possible in the first place, versus a constant awareness of like, we need to protect this mystery as such. The reason why I bring this up is because whatever the situation is, I think Daniel's right in the sense that human beings are, and this is why I really like Heidegger's account, is because we're thrown into a situation. Okay. I don't know anything about nature. If I'm thrown into a situation, all I know about nature is maybe if like somebody's read Aristotle and Jockin is educating me on it, right? But he himself had to be thrown into a situation, swim out of it, discover Aristotle, and then all of a sudden it reorients his orientation and he's now thinking about nature and so on. So it's why is it that whatever nature is, it conducts itself in such a way that human beings have to swim out of the muck that they already find themselves in order to even get a sense of directionality in the first place. So it really goes to show why maybe even like the human emphasis problem is theirs, because human beings for some reason have to swim out of the muck first. But then nature seems to set up the conditions in which human beings have to swim out of the muck. Mm-hmm. And then there's like, you know, I was again going through Heidegger, I'm getting close to finishing Being in Time. Heidegger says something very pivotal here, which he says, if there's no Dasein, then there is no world there. And basically it's like, it means that without human beings, nature is just indeterminate. Like it doesn't make any sense to us unless we're there to swim out of the muck in which we can orient ourselves. And it's like, to me, it's really fascinating because it's like, well, why is the conditions in which we are thrown into as we are born in, like, you know, the 2020s and so on, why are we raised in such a way that we don't know anything about nature until we get discoursed about it within our world, about the way people talk about it? You know, like a 2020s baby is going to learn like God is just another thing that people, like, because it's there's plurality now, there's globalism now. So it's like we're thrown into such a situation where people have to discern themselves out of the muck of being, and then history repeats in such a way that we find ourselves in the same muck, but in a different muck, in which we have to then uncover ourselves to encounter what that mystery of nature is. And for me, it just seems like there is something, I guess the concern really might be about what kind of repetition do we want to actually live? Because there's a sense in which the repetition is, like Daniel points out, well, you can live in such a way that you just stay within the muck, and that's itself a kind of repetition. Or you can live in such a way that you find yourself out the muck, encounter beauty, encounter nature as it is, but then find yourselves recovered by muck to once again get yourself out, only to then get yourself back in. But that is what I think, in my opinion, makes beauty possible. And yeah, so to me, it might even be that the framing of repetition is what is that concern here, versus like this constant like awareness. Because like for me, the reason why mystics keep harping on the awareness of God is because it's so easy to forget. Like it's so easy to forget, and it actually, a lot of the test is actually forgetting, and then coming back, right? So why is it that the course of nature, whatever it is, seems to be in such a way that we have to remind each other, we have to use language to get ourselves out? Like the fact that Daniel even made that distinction between environment and nature already made such a distinction to get ourselves out of this dichotomy between this rut of agency and nature. Like that's we're mediated by language already in such a way that we have to do this all the time. And I feel like, to me, there's such a fickleness to our human situation that we have to do a lot of work just to even get out of the situation in which we realize that we're in one. Before we could even say like, oh yeah, it's about nature, oh, it's about human beings. It's like, well, there's a lot of work that we got to get to before we can even talk about nature and human beings as such, because whatever we're in, it already paints those pictures for us.
Okay. I'm not saying to protect. Excuse me.
He dies. Don't die. Don't die.
This damn toothpick. I'm not saying to protect the mystery. It's not about protecting the mystery. It's that I'm talking about basically Hegel's good infinity. If it's the emphasis is on seeing the infinity within the finite unfolding, and not infinity. I mean, you know the distinction. I think we all know the distinction. Anyway, yeah, thanks for Daniel introducing that to me a while back ago. But anyway, that's what I mean by the sentiment of protect the mystery. Okay,
Yeah.
So let me just quickly go down a bunch of big points that were hit here. The nature and ethic question. There's an ethic, and the ethic is it's the Desmond move. There's this givenness of being. And what that means is that the ethic, how it's toward the other, is by generating otherness. Okay. With that being said, when we see repetition, in otherness, that just means we have an understanding. If we don't see repetition in otherness, that means we're at best having an interpretation. That's what I would say. In terms of the understanding interpretation distinction. With that being said, the idea of if there's no da sign, it's just indeterminacy. I think this is where Desmond's overdeterminacy fits so much better. You're either walking away with an interpretation or an understanding. But that means there is no real world where you actually have a true indeterminate, point of view or perspective. We get a sense of something. Like indeterminacy to me means there's literally no sense of anything, and because that's the case, I don't really see indeterminacy as a good word. I see overdeterminacy as a much better word, because what happens is it's too much information. You never actually get to like this raw information where you're like witnessing indeterminacy. You're over, at best, when you get an interpretation of something, you're overwhelmed by the amount of information that it's reading something to you, that there's something there. Because indeterminacy to me gives the connotation of there being a nothing and not a lack, which we all agree, thanks to like a Jockin move, there is no such thing as nothing. So because there's no such thing as nothing, I want to kind of make the move and say, then there's only overdeterminacy. There is no such thing as indeterminacy at all, because to me, indeterminacy can be equated to the nothing. Overdeterminacy can be equated to lack. Okay. With that being said, when Daniel brings up the distinction with the environment, to me, that just means environment is understanding the work within a context. So to trace the line of thinking here, it's you're seeing a repetition which gives rise, or which simultaneously causes work in order to see the repetition, which means that you are aware of how it's lacking, okay, that you're aware of the ontological ground of that particular context, because like Jockin was saying, like kind of what I was saying, is that lack is the ground of that context in which you realize repetition in. It's not necessarily the ground where all possible contexts are. That I would give to Desmond with the givenness aspect in that way. Hi, there's a cat out there, and dogs with cats. Hold on, let me just grab it. And now he's running from me. I'm not chasing after you. And basically, the consequence to seeing, environment in this way, lack in this way, is that noose. The consequence is that we get in contact with noose, from what I'm gathering with what you're saying, Jockin, and the research that I've done, that noose thus creates when we're in contact with noose, okay, I would say that creates is a being who has a da sign. That is actually the end result of being in contact with noose, because it actually generates something that's thematic, that then, kind of what I was saying before you got on the call, once that's the case, that being has its own agenda that overlaps with your own agenda, in which the contact with noose was present. You had a certain agenda. Not saying that you went into it intentionally. What I mean is that to be in contact with noose means, like I was saying, you're understanding a repetition. You're understanding an ontological ground of lack, and therefore, when you create something, the byproduct is this being that has its own da sign, that then has its own repetition with its own understanding that overlaps with the repetition understanding in which you were dwelling in when making contact with noose. So I think that's like at the end of the day, that's the actual stakes the stakes here is because there is this emphasis on nature that causes the in a certain sense such a focus on the response to this to nature's givenness that it has the potential within that friction, within that dichotomy, the stakes are so high that it actually can create beings with their own Dasein. And like I make a little tangent thing just because I'm on thinking about it. That's what the whole, capital is AI. I think all that is basically simply a byproduct of the meeting of nous, essentially. The other thing here is when you have an understanding of a repetition, it doesn't mean you know the mystery. It means you understand what's lacking. And what's lacking, there's no way of necessarily resolving, I could just fill in that lack. And that understanding how to stand with lack is, in a certain sense, protecting the mystery. I would say overlooking lack means that you're thinking that you can control the whole situation here. That's the danger. And while you're thinking that, there's these other forces at play. And that's the irony, where when you think you're in most control, you're actually being controlled significantly because there's all these forces at play that are influencing your mode of being, so much so. And when you understand lack, then you realize the possibilities more. You see things in possibilities. But I think, and then this is the provocative thing here, because I don't think you need to choose a religion to get there. That's the provocative thing, because I know, I would say, like with my conversation with Javier, I'm venturing to say that you do have to kind of make a choice in that regard. I think that choice is choosing an understanding of the givenness of the context in which you can have an interpretation with, when I think that's overreaching. It would be my claim right now, that being able to choose a context does not require a religion. It requires a certain passion. No, hold on. It's not that you understand the religion and how it works. It's that picking a religion in this conversation doesn't necessarily equate to seeing a repetition of understanding.
Yeah, but how do you determine the difference between non-religion and religion as such if it's not complete?
It's just not. I would say it's like,
because this comes down to the same thing that I was talking to you about. Like, what is secularism when we say that it's not it? Like, what is secularism when we say, like, secularism says you can pick a religion?
Secularism doesn't have a repetition of understanding. That's the problem with secularism. I'm making the claim that you can have a repetition of understanding without diving into the religious dimension. If you grant that there's an inherent givenness of being that gives rise to context, like from a conceptual standpoint, I think that's all you need in order to investigate these interpretations.
But Luber, you're killing me. Okay, but like, okay, here's the thing though. You're already accepting a certain cutting off of religion, because in Greek and religious life, like I told you before, religion was life. Like they didn't call it religion. Like, yeah, like religion was life.
I understand the move. I'm saying that, okay, let's give a very particular example here, okay, of what I mean by picking a context, okay? I don't need to have I'm a gardener, okay? And I understand how certain foods, the repetition in which certain foods, the stakes in which these foods, it takes to grow these foods. Now, I think all you need to know going into that from beyond that particular context is, oh, life gives me I was born on a farm. I was born with a mom that you understand these outside factors that contributed to you getting a certain repetition. I don't think it needs to go any further than that in order to become a gardener. That's my thing. I think that is a separate dimension than just doing the work of gardening. Like that would be my example, the provocative claim, which I know would do this, by the way. So go ahead.
And I'll tell you what, Luber, here's my first objection to this claim. Religion, besides what Javier hunted up with life, the other side of it is religion is supposed to be, it's under justice. And in particular, it's because you have a sense of justice that you are dependent on something that you need. In justice, you must pay, that you feel you must pay back, or give in debt to, you're in debt, you have to pay back to. Now, just to clarify that a little more sympathetically to what we're talking about here, there has to be something you have to love. You have to love. So the point is, what you love is actually the orientation of religion. So what I'm kind of getting at is just having, unless you're going to sit here and tell me unless you're going to tell me the lack is enough to answer that question of what you're going to be devoted to, you have to make a religion, because it's in that mode of justice of your beloved. So that would be the general, I think that would be the traditional stance about your charge is the problem with secularism, there is no love. There's not love to the devoted, only to the self. It's an individual subject that has an arbitrary choice of freedom to be awash in the doxa of not having a first principle that orient around. That would be the charge against secularism, that you have no love. There's something you feel devoted to in love that you have to do in a relationship of religion in that sense. That's my only reply. Daniel.
Well, first off,
I'm so sorry. There's one more reply.
Please, Mr. Jockin.
Just to my notes, I forgot this. Also, Luber is actually an aspect related to your work between environment and subject. Here's another note, and there's the context of nous. Here's an actually nice little bonus from Udemy and Ethics. It gets told that virtue, arete, is the instrument of nous. That's incredibly powerful, because remember, non-human sentient non-humans have virtue too. This is an ontological status, not a moral human choice question from Aristotle's point of view. So that's another aspect of the interpenetration of virtue, of not just in human subjects, but in all of existence. And if this is all attended to and it's an instrument of nous, this means nous is not just simply something humans have. So that's another aspect of this. But also on a personal level, I just want to actually note, by the way, before I became religious, you know what I do a lot when I have to see a beautiful sunset or have a moment of contemplation, of just apprehension of a beautiful thing? I would say, I love you, life. I would say that. It was like I wasn't willing yet to go across the line to say God, but I was able to say life at that time. So that's also why Javier's note about religion and life, it's a reasonable intuition, because I personally went through that experience myself. Okay, Daniel, floor is yours.
No, magnificent. You guys are fantastic. I think I got these tea tree Australian chewing sticks in the 4th grade. I have about 4 left after maybe, I guess this would be about 28 years. I don't, but I think I'm going to get one for you fine people. So there will only 3 left after this. This is an Australian tea tree. I can't light it, but it's hot. It's like got a huge cinnamon blast by it. Oh, this is a good year. This is like 95. Oh, it's a good year. Oh my gosh. So anyway, there's a bunch of wonderful things. So there's a question of what is the difference between choosing a religion and choosing to be in the presence of a religion. And perhaps you don't have to choose a religion, but you do have to choose to be in the presence of a religion. And then the argument is what most people do. Do most people choose a religion, or do they choose to be in the presence of a religion, right? Because, you know, there's a million Christians with different ideas who say, I'm going to be in the presence of this tradition, these beliefs, or Islam, or I can go on. And there is seemingly a necessity to choosing to be in the presence of a religion. Now, you mentioned that there can be problems with the language of underdetermination, and I'm not that indetermination. What's very interesting is the problem overdetermination blurs with indetermination because of excess, right? Excess is also indeterminable. And this brings to mind Mr. Ebert's work. But I would say there seemingly is overdetermination and underdetermination as opposed to indetermination, meaning a thing is not determined enough to be definitive to draw you in, right? And the risk, so in choosing, yeah, I do need Aspasia to send me more. Aspasia, if you are seeing this, I need more chewing sticks. So there's an issue where the problem is if everyone must choose to be in the presence of a religion, there is the risk of not being enough in its presence that it is underdetermined, and therefore not definitive enough to draw you in or to have any sort of impact or to come forth as thematic because it is underdetermined. Because for me, you know, I talk a lot about overfitting and underfitting, and this is the map is the territory problem. I think also is just a note, the problem that I think we are also facing is that there seemingly is some sort of developmental logic in operation. And as one develops, the terms change along the way as if they were always those terms instead of the others, along with the dichotomies and the comparisons. And there's always this changing of the language as if this was always the language that should have been used, but you couldn't get there until you go through the, so for example, you have to go through a phase where the language of, say, agent and environment is proper, where it seems like we're agents to actually get to the place where, no, it seems like freedom is more about making yourself subject to something. And so it was always the case that you were a subject. There's this odd problem where in the development, there is a certain rewriting of all of the steps that occurred, but it is a rewriting out of the material that you use to get there, that if you did not use to get there would not be used there. So there's always that problem, I think, in philosophical discourse, where the language itself is live. The language itself is live because otherwise we're trapped in language, right? But this actually is a testament to nous because you're apprehending actually more than receiving the definitions of the terms, you are apprehending what the changes in terms are pointing to and following that. And you're following something, right? But how odd that you can sense when you're following something, even if you don't know where it's going, right? How is it that you can sense that you're following something, but you don't know what it is you're following? And yet it's not arbitrary. You know darn well it isn't just your taste. You sense it, right? It's there, right? So there seems to be overdetermination, which mixes with the indeterminate. You could also say overdetermination. So there's some interesting issues here. And I know by overdetermination, Mr. Desmond is speaking to basically the univocal, you're making it mathematical. You are over-determining things into a univocity by which you can understand everything and you lose difference, and he's going to be favoring more of the equivocable, if I ever say that term correctly, which is not making the mistake of overdetermination, because once you overdetermine something, it loses the mystery. It is no longer open, and it is no longer something you need to relate to because you know it, you control it. You don't need to relate to something you've programmed. You don't need to relate to something that isn't alive because it's alive. It just, it's programmed. It's a system, right? So overdetermination removes the need for relationality because you know what it is going to do. Please note what's interesting here is relation, by definition, then, is a word that suggests mystery. It suggests a continual, openness to that which you cannot predict. Where programming and systemizing and overdetermining is precisely the possibility of knowing something without relating to it, right? Like the overdeterminable is that which you can know without continual presence, right? Whereas the proper fittingness is where determinedness is always no greater or no less than the relation itself and what manifests in the relation itself, right? So then the question becomes, what does one's posture need to be to religion to keep it in that bifitting, I suppose is the term, versus underfitting, overfitting, this sort of fittedness, this sort of sense of being on the trajectory. And it does seem that you need to choose a religion to be in the presence of, and then that is gauged by the sense of when it is not on the side of underdetermination versus where you're not underdetermining it, because at that point it's no longer definitive and therefore cannot attract you, right? And that's probably going to be some presence that brings you an actual relation with actual people, congregations, those who actually believe these things, who are actually compelled, and also a relation to a tradition. I think here's the key point. One must relate to a religion to some degree where it can have a kind of authority on you. Like it actually can have a say on what you do. If the religion, you may be going to church every Sunday and it not have a say on what you're doing. So it's not, that's kind of an interesting idea, right? When we're saying being in the presence of, we're saying presence to the degree that it actually has causal impact, authoritative causal impact on you, right? Which of course speaks of some sort of theme, does it not? Because then we have the question of theme that I think is being suggested here. So there's also an interesting issue where the line between design and ethics is rather thin. And when environment becomes nature, if you grant that, there is a simultaneous apprehension of a design and thus an ethic. And what's weird is you don't know what the design is, and yet you apprehend its presence. So let me fill that out a little bit, because I think this starts bringing together, life and nous and lack and this problem of subject and nature. So my beloved Austin Farah, who the great William Wilson wrote a very important essay on, and Mr. Farah wrote a book called The Finite and the Infinite, but I'll give you a key idea of this book, is he was trying to argue that you can't separate, like if I say ethics is inseparable from design, and design is inseparable from ethics. So if I ask you, what's the difference between a flower and a weed? Well, there are many weeds that look like flowers, like weeds, morning glories are quite pretty, but it's because you didn't intend the morning glories in your garden, right? If you're able to make a distinction between a flower and a weed, it means by definition, there must be some design by which that distinction can be made, right? You can say this is a flower, this is supposed to be here, and this is not. So the issue is, of course, if you say this is wrong and this is right, this is justice, this is not, you can only be saying that if there's some sort of design or some sort of standard or whatever in which this is just relative to or not. The reason why this is extremely important is because basically it means design, it means the argument of design, creation, he's arguing kind of neo-Thomist in some different ways. The argument, like Kant's separation of the ethical and the ontological, he's basically saying you cannot do that, because if you speak of the ethical, you are also going to be speaking of the ontological in the design, right? These things are not separate, because the moral law must always be a testament to a certain way things should be. And if you're saying a way things should be, then you're speaking of some sort of design, ergo trajectory. Well, the reason, again, I say this is very interesting, because basically it means the word ethic and design are always collapsed into one another. And the word theme, when Mr. Luber can push back against this if I am incorrect, the word theme is very interesting because it blends together what? Design, and it blends together ethic. There is simultaneously a certain apprehension of a design and an ethic at the same time. But here's the weird thing. Aren't designs final? Aren't designs like, aren't you comparing the design with a final blueprint to say, oh, this is right versus wrong? Well, this is the weird thing where human apprehension is a very interesting capacity to judge a design and to actually know very concretely what is following the design versus not, and yet not knowing the completion, not knowing the final state, not knowing actually what it is that you are designing. It is an open situation that you are designing, and you have a certain sense relative to virtue of what is aligned with that or not. But since it is open, there is a certain invitation for you to participate in it. And yet that participation does not come down to a mere subjective taste, right? All of this seems impossible unless reality, to take the next step, in its isness, which means nature, is actually time-space versus space-time, right? If nature is actually time-space and time is fundamental, then the apprehension that seems to align with nous is thematic, in that it is a bringing together of the ethical and the design, of which then you are working to align with and be waiting for the posture of best participating in, that in its openness then is invitational. And because it is open, there is also some sort of experience of a kind of lack, because it lacks completeness. And where there's lack, there's the possibility of desire. And because we tend to form desire relative to what we lack. And when you have lack that is a product of this openness, it then becomes drive. So what you begin apprehending, here is the point, the apprehension that is the thematic blending of the design and the ethic is tied to an experience of eros, as Mr. Jockin has been speaking to. This bringing out this sort of aliveness. And then the ethical is tied precisely to the ecstasy of that, because excessive ecstasy of that alignment with that thing that is opening. And you see in that, then I think what you're seeing is then, of course, the thematic command would be, do not let your desire get in the way of the ecstasy or something. Do not let your desire for a completed design get in the way of the designing. Do not let your desire for completion get in the way of being completed, completing in that certain openness. Now, there is more to be said on the eros point, because this is important, and I think Cardinal Newman in his Grammar of Assent is quite useful for this. But I will pause there in suggesting that theme, I think, is alluding to the blending of the design and ethical that Austin Farrer is suggesting, which then the thematic is alignment with the time space, which has an openness that then makes the possibility of an eros and a drive and a desire that then creates an intimacy. And then the question is the following: can one actually properly fit themselves to this configuration without the presence of a religion, to a degree that can actually have authority on them, that can actually compel them? And I think questions like that arise, but I'll stop.
You're the fucking man, honestly. Okay, so that is the question that was so brilliantly laid out. So I like the distinction you made between choosing a religion and essentially being in the presence of a religion. Okay. So, and I like how you played with overdetermined for that. And I think that's a good place to start.
And I will note, not to interrupt, a good test of if you're in the presence of a religion is if it can destroy you. Like if you're not close enough to where the thing can have a certain destruction on you or piercing, maybe the word piercing is good because that's love and destruction kind of go together. The question then is the right presence. And I think those things arise, but I interrupted. Please, Mr. Luber.
No. Okay. I want to say there's an oscillation that occurs where when you choose a religion, you're not necessarily in the presence of a religion. And I think when you're in the act of doing the work, you see the repetition, basically the thought path that I'm talking about. You have already chose a religion, and then in the work, in the presence of a religion, so to speak, you've forgotten about it. Now, what my point here is that the point is, like, can we do the work? Can we be in this mode without choosing a religion? Are we commanded too. And I think there are ways in which I think doing the work just requires the presence of religion, which doesn't necessarily mean that in that moment you're also choosing a religion. I think if we think about it time-wise, you can have in your heart of hearts chose a religion and it not be cognized. Like, my whole thing is, why does it need to be cognized in order to do the work? I think you could be commanded and be in the presence of religion and it still not even be cognized. I think there could be like environmental things that actually prevent it from being cognized, which I think what that does in a negative way is probably makes it less likely for being in the presence of religion to spread. I think that's what that would. I think that's. I'm not saying religion. Like, basically, I'm saying religion is necessary, but it's not. The choosing of a particular religion isn't necessary for doing work. And I think what people get caught up with is essentially doing the work genuinely requires choosing a religion. But I think that's not the case. I think a lot of people can have a religiosity, being in the presence of religion, doing the work, and it's like they don't really have a religion necessarily cognized. You know, the spiritual people are like, "Oh, I'm spiritual," and most of the time it's like bullshit. But, you know, when they're talking about the particular work that they're doing, though, it could seem like they're in the presence of a religion. That's what I think we have to play with there. And I think thinking about things from a design standpoint thematically will naturally make people have to presuppose, in a certain sense, a choice. Like they have to choose a thema. Like there's already something that they're choosing to a context in order to get there. And I think you might forget how to do the work if you don't ever make a choice, but I think it doesn't take away the possibility of like doing work and just being in the presence of religion. If you grant me this like distinction with the presence versus the choice, because yeah, I just think
just as a very quick note, I think there's a hard issue too. Like just quickly, like many people, you could make the distinction of, oh, I don't want to, I want to be in the presence of a religion because you're actually avoiding making a commitment and it's done out of fear. Whereas there is, of course, and the Dante asked the question, what if the Ethiopian who has never heard of God or whatever, do they have any? So there's, in many religious traditions, there's the open possibility of someone not formally being part of a religion who nevertheless participates in it. But then often that could be used as an argument to justify not the fear that one has of being seen as joined into a tradition. So what's very interesting is there's a certain heart element that comes in, which then I guess supposes something thematic. So it just depends, right? But I interrupted.
No, that's good. I think if you're going by the fear route, then obviously that's not right. But if you're going by the confused route, I would say, if you're in a culture where there's all these different possibilities and you're just confused, you're not fearful, you're just confused because there's like too much in a certain sense. I think that actually gives rise to just being thematic and being in the presence of a religion. That would be my claim, basically. And I'm gonna pass it off because my dog definitely has to poop.
It's good you noticed before the dog actually pooped. So good job, good owner.
Yeah, because I was going to comment just on that note of basically we're just swimming in doxa, in opinion. That's our problem. So what once was a given is now a matter of just a swimming doxa of you can do this religion, you can do this thing, you can do this thing. Up, admit it, okay? Yeah, I think this idea of systems and presence, design and ethic, it's very good stuff. I mean, also, by the way, on the note of love, I'm trying to look it up. I know I forgot what Aquinas' first mode of love is, but he gives this kind of relationship of love. I forgot what this first one is, but it's ecstasy and liquefaction. It might be It might be. I think it might be zeal. Maybe the first one. So it has a relationship. There's a kind of. It actually works out in our discussion of the beautiful in terms of applying it. It's an interiority. Basically, starts with the interiority, then it goes to the exteriority, and then there's the breaking of the indwelling relationship of the interior to the exterior together. So that whole relationship of development of love is very, as you said, Daniel, with this kind of noesis thematic with a lack apprehended, which is a possibility of desire, motion against the grounding of that, which moves to drive. That's basically the language of the ecstasy, basically the kind of the zealot kind of awareness. I'm going to use that language. I don't know if that's necessarily what Aquinas would have said, but then into ecstasy, which is awareness of the other outside, and then the drive driven from that into a liquefaction, a unity that occurs. I think that's quite powerful.
I mean, I think I'll just, before we start switching over, well, thank you, Daniel, for bringing up that distinction between presence of religion and then choosing a religion. You know, yeah, I mean, like even like Catholic understanding, right? Like the person that doesn't have any religion as such can still have some presence, some direction. The possibility is always there. I guess you could say, when did because this is something that I've been trying to get at Luber for a long time, which I think you finally kind of raised it, Daniel, of just like, well, there's a difference between religion as such and presence of religion as such, whereas a lot of our understanding of religion, and speaking for perhaps the general population, is just they take religion as God versus God that religion as the means to cultivating a relationship with God. But for some reason, the design in religion has hijacked God in such a way that actually you conflate presence of religion with religion. And so then we get this issue of like a lot of what the modern theologians are trying to answer to is like, well, how do we reframe religion in which you understand there is a difference between religion as such and presence of religion, presence of God, so to speak. And actually, you know, there's already like when Luber talks about like, well, doing the work. So here's some of the issues, right? What do we mean by like doing the work? Because, for example, and this is going to go into like Daniel's design argument, which is, if religion is designed in such a way that actually people think doing the work is following the rules, then you might have a problem, right? This leads to possible manipulation, other errors, dogmas that don't seem to change, and so on. But then if you have the more open-ended structure, which I wouldn't even say it's open-ended, it's more like the spirituality as such, where they just use the praxis but detached from the history of religion as such. So they're doing the work, right? But so they're meditating, they're doing all this stuff, they're borrowing from religion. But why is their misunderstanding so misguided? Is because they are not rooting themselves in the actual history of religion as such. Because what are the dangers of these practices? Right? You don't just meditate for 5 hours and then not go crazy at a certain time period, right? Like people have been talking about how meditation itself has a kind of danger about if you just do this. And it's because, why? It's because we have the wrong orientation where Buddhist teachers would actually show you, but instead it's been hijacked by kind of Western framing. You got these health coaches and stuff like that. And so people are actually going crazy in meditation, which means you've been messing with some real shit. You know, you're messing with some real shit, which is why even in the mystical realm, you kind of do need some type of guidance, some type of book, some type of rules to subject yourself to understand that to not get taken over by phantasms. And so this idea of doing the work is interesting because there's a sense in which people think doing the work is following the rules. But then there's the other side where people think doing the work is just doing the practices. But if you do the practices detached from history of religion as such, you actually misplace you actually underdetermine the possible dangers in which you place yourself in a possible presence of religion. So like basically what I'm saying is you can encounter the presence of religion, but it will destroy you. Yes, Luber.
Let me just say where I'm coming from. I'm looking at the world and we're living in right now. That's where I'm coming from. Like,
Yeah,
I
me
want to
too.
be real in the sense where it's like, okay, are we actually going to be able to make majority people actually religious in order to do basically thematic things? Is how I'm thinking about it. And I'm thinking like, no. Like, I don't think unless some otherworldly, insane, like sci-fi like scenario or just like fantasy like scenario occurs, I don't think that's a reality. Now, that's not saying that this like religious thing is wrong at all, because I don't. There's something to it that needs to be sublated. That's what I'm poking at. So I'm trying to think through how to be thematic, how to do thematic things. That's what I mean by work, essentially. And yet understand how that's even a thing. And then, oh, okay, we're understanding how that's even a thing, and you realize you hit this natural theological, this religious dimension, God dimension, whatever. I understand there's a distinction between the religious and just God, which you said and granted, but just for the sake of getting the sentiment across, it has to do with that. But it can't be packaged in a way that is how we've once understood it, because it doesn't seem like we're going to be able to, not to be crude here, but to sell it. We're not going to be able to sell it in this world. And we need to sell some sort of sublated version of that to this world. And that's that to me is the basically what we're getting at. I mean, what the conversation's like poking at and scratching at here. And I think you guys had your hands up. I cut you off. You do your thing. Sorry. But
Well,
this is good so far.
Yeah, well, I'll just add that. So basically what I'm putting at is, doesn't necessarily negate a two-pronged approach, so to speak, right? Because when I gave you the example of people are being invited to poetry by people that don't read poetry, right? That's a very amazing feature in itself. But basically, like, you're still stuck with this problem of like, well, you can't convince the people within religion in which to change that orientation, right? So
I'm just saying you don't have to do that either. That's
Yeah.
I think you can have both.
Okay.
That's what I think. That's what I think is the only solution in a certain sense to accelerationism.
Okay, so it's an emphasis problem then.
Exactly. It's how, like, kind of to circle back to what I was saying in the beginning. I agree that the emphasis is on nature, but the question is, how exactly do we emphasize nature? That's the question. I don't think it's a debate anymore that the emphasis should be on nature, but it's how now.
Yeah, I'll let Daniel go.
Magnificent. So there's a few things I asked myself. So, one of the advantages, say, of being explicitly and known as a Christian, especially when it was not cool, I guess it started to get cool, or like in 2008 or whatever, for a long time, like being religious was not cool. Everyone here knows that. So, is that first, it forces you to face humiliation. Second, it forces you to feel embarrassment. Third, you have to actually deal with difference, Because one of the things, like, for example, if we have Jewish and Muslim and Christian, all these different things, like, we actually have to deal with those tensions, right? Whereas one of the things that often, unfortunately, say with atheism is the posture is more deconstructive, or you have to serve them. Like, you have to defend your religion to them, right? And what you end up then is a apologetic, just endless apologetics, right? It doesn't tend to go anywhere. What's very interesting when you get the right interfaith dialogue, it's not just apologetic games. It's some sort of very interesting orbiting of something that people are open to, that they need their particular conditioning. And interestingly, one could argue their very capacity for being able to do that kind of engagement comes from the embarrassment, humiliation, commitment, putting themselves into something they don't fully understand, and then having to care about people of all different personalities, walks of life. Because that's another key thing with religion. You're dealing with people who are college educated, blue collar, white collar, lower educated. Like, it puts you in the presence of poor, building houses. Like, you're in the presence of many different people, right? I am of the opinion that what you're suggesting there, Mr. Luber, of a certain virtue, a certain capacity that is gained in religion, if we say that everyone must join a religion to have thematic thinking, that seems to be problematic. But it also seems to be non-negotiable that you actually have to go through those unique experiences that religion, I think, can afford you. That especially if you are religious in pluralism. Now, I would actually argue that religion doesn't necessarily give you those things if you're just stuck in people who think the same way, right? It's religion when it's confronted with difference that seems to be the sweet spot, in my opinion, actually. But what is it about the meeting of difference that actually works on the individual in a very virtuous way? I think it is, one, a result of them having a clear position that maybe themselves. Here's the key. I would actually argue that entering religion is not the end of confusion. It actually is more, because you have lots of confusion still in the religion, actually, or you're still thinking about things. When you enter a religion, you can be seen as that religion, which means you get encounters with people, almost like practices, that then you have to learn to deal with, that are very, very hard, and you get short and tempered, and you just don't want to deal with people, and you're tempted to just be around people who think like you, and there are certain temptations and difficulties that you uniquely have to face when you can be clearly seen as something. What I would argue is that the non-negotiable for the possibility of thematic thinking is being seen as something that you then have to be seen as, and not given to the temptation of disowning it or deconstructing it or treating it with a postmodern irony or something like that, right? That, I think, is critical. So then the question is the following. Is there a possible infrastructure or a design of a certain way of people interacting that would give them or increase the probability of those kind of experiences without necessarily explicitly going into a religion? Well, I do associate the social coordination mechanism with actually affording that possibility, because if you're coming into spaces like this and having conversations, you actually have to stand for something or speak to something or actually take a clear position, then that will start giving you those sort of impacts. And a lot of times it will actually, without necessarily explicitly forcing a person into a religion, it can bring you to the place where you go, I guess I've never actually thought about religion, have I? I've never actually considered these things seriously. Like, there's a certain virtue potential of the social coordination mechanism that could have some isomorphic similarities with joining a religion, but it all depends on how it's done, the details, and stuff like that, right? But that, I would certainly say that there is something, what I actually find is that the problem of confusion is somehow addressed with precisely facing humiliation or standing for something. There's something about actually having to be in the presence of other people with something you can be seen as that works on the problem of confusion and the mental illness and psychosis that comes from that. Because even if you're not sure or you can't say all of the different ideas, the very experience of that almost has some sort of medicine to the human being. And I think it's because it is a virtue builder. And the medicine is actually tied to virtue in alignment with nature of this certain openness to that which you're, because what's another key characteristic of love and eros, right? Well, going through the hurt. When you love someone, you're pulled through the pain. You stand even though there's difficulty. The lover is who can destroy you, and that costs you, right? Well, that is when you could be seen as a particular religious position, what you are in fact doing. And if that is, I don't know if you can be thematic if you can't face the piercing pain of love. If you can't be hurt by a lover, there's something about the thematic, in my opinion, that must require the possibility of facing pains like can be faced when dealing with love, right? Is that not precisely, well, that seems to me to be the storied potential, right? The storied potential has that certain pain of love, that certain piercing. And I know you have to go in a moment. So these things seem to be in the soup, I suppose. And there is then, if there is something about the piercing and being seen as, I do think beauty is like this because no one believes in beauty anymore, right? So if you take a clear stand of defending beauty, it is like taking a clear stand for a religious tradition and actually being seen as defending it. And then people are like, are you an idiot? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, you fool, right? Everyone knows that. And so the defense of beauty has a certain formal similarity with being seen as a religion, and thus standing for beauty and being committed to it can have this virtue. Likewise, lack is weird. Standing for this or standing for metaphysics. No one, what, you an idiot? Didn't you get the memo that metaphysics is over? You guys are talking philosophy. Don't you know this won't get you a job? Why are you here spending this time? All of this actually has structures of standing and being seen as doing something of which you then have to be clearly identified with and stand for, and that has something to do with the conditions of cultivating virtue, without which thinking thematically is not possible. And so there are things I think people can do that are like the religion. And you could actually, I think, argue that in a situation where everyone around you is going to pat you on the back and say, I'm so glad you're a good Christian little boy, that actually will not be the fulfillment. That's actually bad, right? So it's this very particular situation of religious amidst difference, of a stand amidst stands, and learning to relate in that I think is very important. But this would bring me to things to say on the absolute choice. And also the issue of lack as a universal, which I think every map entails a lack, which is the potential, but I will stop at this point.
If you guys want to keep going, I will 1000% listen to whatever you guys have to say. I do have to bounce.
Sorry, Luber, how about this? How about, because you're the one that wanted to talk about the Beatitudes. Do you want to just summarize? How about you close off by just sharing your points about that, and then Daniel, myself, and Javier can
Okay.
reply. Then you can look at the report.
Basically, I think the Beatitudes is just when the virtue is based off having a repetition of understanding, which means you're in contact with nous, and that means that virtue is coming from the contact with nous. And I think that's ultimately what the Beatitudes are. Now, I think coming in contact with nous, to piggyback off of what Daniel's saying, comes from taking a position with indifference. So, like, I think, for example, in this conversation, me taking this position helps me think through the very same things in which you're thinking through, but with a difference. Here's the caveat, though. My choice of that will have ramifications outside of my life here, where your choices will also have ramifications out of your life. And I think that's Daniel's point. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Daniel, I think he would argue that it's like your life is probably going to be worse in a certain sense by taking that choice, yet you can still participate in being thematic by not choosing that. That's what I think the caveat is. Now, I have to think about that more, so I think there's something definitely to it. And unless I'm mistaken, I will say, from my understanding, when the Beatitudes like occur, there's a certain like meaning. There, you feel very like from an emotional standpoint. Let's say you feel very meaningful when something like that in that dimension, if you will. So I think that it's basically a scaling thing where it's like, okay, whose absolute choice is more meaningful? That's not to say there's things, a choice that's not meaningful when you hit that contact with nous, basically. But I think that would be hard to discern. Actually, I think that's a game that I don't know if I'm willing to play. But I do got to go. I'm looking forward to hearing this. Love you guys.
Love you, Luber. Bye.
I'm a little bit at a loss about the complication. I guess, but the whole point is that when you talk about the positionality and difference and virtue from the rendition of the petition with the Beatitudes are really particular because they're a complete inversion of the typical norms at that time. And in fact, some of them, the one that actually, one that really sticks really hard is the poor in spirit. That's a very powerful statement. Because obviously there's the kind of obvious translation of poverty, but that may not mean that necessarily just material poverty. There's certain readings of that as more the spiritual dependence aspect of it. But in general, it's the kind of like, I guess I don't know, man. Like on Luber's project or question about reintroducing in the post-secular world, the reintroduction of the religious. One angle is kind of what Daniel brought up, this kind of Kierkegaard energy of we're not Christians because we're not actually in the orientation Christianity really was originated in, which is in this radical difference, humiliation, crushing, persecution. So if you're not in that persecutional kind of action, that very old school mode of social political orientation, of your definition of identity is in relationship to an oppressor, shutting you down, humiliating you, killing you, ostracizing you. You're not Christian. The problem is that, you could use that same mode of positioning to talk about the post-secular world that Daniel, yes, it was not cool to be religious. Now it's starting to be, but it's because it's actually the same dynamic, is that there's a kind of a hegemony of secular capitalist orientation, that religion is kind of, the religious orientation has this right-wing coded and kind of avant-garde reaction to the majority or to the default position. So it's like a response to defaultness. That's kind of the thrust of it. That's not necessarily the case, but that's definitely one direction about it. And I think Daniel making good points about this, that these are definitely stressors that do reveal skin in the game. It's very easy to be of a faith when it's just the normative statements. And actually, that whole point of religion becoming a nominal faith versus an actual faith, I think that actually is very important, because most Westerners are nominally religious. They say they're Christian, but if you actually look at their beliefs and their actions, they're not Christian in any sense, really. Or Muslim. And by the way, there's plenty of nominally Muslims, by the way. So this is not just a Christian problem. But actually, the very fact that religiosity, this kind of to be seen, can become a persona, as opposed to a lived experience of actually living. And by the way, listen, it is funny from the religious accounts of when miracles were happening, when prophets could generate predictions that would happen, and they could produce actual miracles in front of people and invert nature on command via God acting through them. It is very particular that it was not enough to convince everybody unanimously. It was not enough. Even though that's actually the highest standard, demonstration of that level is actually the highest standard of persuasion. I think is usually argued. Aristotle has that argument. A demonstration through explicit experience is the strongest demonstration for Aristotle, especially of first premises. Like a first principle can't be proved. You can only demonstrate. You can only experience it. That's Aristotle's notes about that. But yet even that level, when religions can do that, had that, The fact that that was not enough to convince everybody. The Quran's very clear about this. We present miracles to you and you still deny us. That kind of language shows up.
Yep.
It is very important. I think that goes to show it kind of depends what we want religion to be or what is its mechanism or structure. Because, for most of religion, it was oriented towards the good. That's really how it operated. And that allowed for a social coordination around that relationship. We basically now entered a state of condition where economic consumption can do that for us. Secularism is kind of correct about that, in the sense that, and by the way, it does cause literally, I wrote notes of like a kind of form of way of life, an ethos. There are certain ways you present you dress, you eat, you talk, you act, you relate. All these things are being defined by your social political orientation. It's true. Because the very fact you can get memes of like, look at my day in my life, and it's like a corporate tech job kind of thing, right? And they're like, it's so fascinating that there's like a trend of like this whole thing with like these like affluent men who are like getting up at 3 a.m., kind of putting the sparkling water down in ice with lemon in it, do a face plunge. They work out. Like it's a way of life. It's a communicational kind of life. Or you go in corporate space and those jokes about kind of corporate speak. They even entirely, literally, it's no different. It's a religious speech. It is, with certain coded language that has certain relationships and actually have certain results. They have certain effects in the social coordination. The point is that basically religion, the things that religion used to do, social capital has replaced with digital technology. So now it's kind of actually on my lecture notes, my lectures I've been doing recently about AI introduction and design. When photography showed up, that opened a serious question of what is the purpose of painting. Did it destroy painting? No. It definitely transformed it though. It revealed an opening because the question of mimetic imitation was no longer a question that humans could do it better than machines. Machines did it better, far better, way less time. It took about 60 years for that to happen, but it happened. Eventually, basically by the late 1800s into the 20th century, photography was basically, if you want to imitate a depiction of reality by light, photography, chemical photography did it better than humans. Net average, right? Par average. AI right now is about the same. We're at that lynch point. We're about at that inflection point where that's about to happen for AI design, where AI can basically get you most of the outputs of a design on average, equivalently, but in way less time. Basically, instead of taking hours to do something, you get it done in seconds. So it's like that order of magnitude speed difference. The time, actually, it's a time parameter. That's basically what's going on there. But the point is, like, painting didn't go away when photography reached that level of mimetic imitation. So the original purpose of function of painting was mimetic imitation, imagery. When that was removed, because photography did it better, painting became something else. It became an investigation of form. There's also other discussions you can say about that. Likewise, design will do the same thing. And one can make an open question now. Religion has a different function now because of that. But with some weird interactions, like I think especially it's when religious codedness is occurring on social media or on digital technology, or prosperity gospels occurring. We have these transformations that are, one can say, super jacking or kind of piggybacking off, or the dynamic is interesting. The trad cap, it's a literally mimetic space now at this point. Orthodox 2, Author Bros, that's a big one. So I think I appreciate Luber's kind of drawing this point up. But I think it is kind of the general off-the-cuff reflection about it. How best to put this? It's open. I actually have a general position of, it's just interesting. Religion was meant to be the social coordination, but now once we have techno capital that's operating instead, what is religion's purpose now? Actually, my gut instinct, and actually the thing that techno capital can't do or is not measured to do, is beauty. It inherently is against it. Goodness, it's very good for. Goodness is excellent at. It is. Do good. You can orient towards a good very well, and do it very efficiently, very effectively, and do it via a social coordination mechanism of money very effectively. But beauty is seems to be a whole different domain, because it seems so antithetical to the relation to the structures of social capital, techno capital. So it would seem to be, and actually, some of my more sympathetic religious individuals I follow and read, they have an orientation of beauty as their orientation, because you can experience. That's the point. In a world without miracle experiences, what else can we have to present the experience to people to be persuaded into a relationship of love? Beauty. That's the only answer. And beauty is actually the most. And that's what I'm getting at, is that beauty is incredibly, yet at once accessible to all, but also the most difficult to understand. So it actually has that relationship both ways. And I say that because usually the religious traditions are aware of their beauty, and that's actually the thing that preserves them the most right now. Catholics with their cathedrals and their stained glass and their Gregorian chant, Islam with our calligraphy, our mosques, and our Islam and our recitation, and in fact the Quran herself. From an Islamic point of view, our argument is that the proof of the miracle of experience is in the Quran. That's our argument, but that's only really understandable for those who know Arabic. To be fair, you have to know Arabic to understand the penetration of what that means, the signification of that statement. But that be just my general. That's a very long-winded answer, but that's my general answer, which doesn't really apply to anything Luber said. So I'm a little like, okay, but that's what I got.
Yeah, I mean, Jockin sparked it for me. So I think, Daniel, I'm thinking about what you're saying about design and ethics and design. There's a sense in which the Beatitudes get the wrong design because they're already fixing the design in which they get their ethics from. So for example, because I'm going through like the Catholic program right now, right? Becoming Catholic. They will say that you should correct someone because they are in the falsity of the truth, right? But that already assumes that we have pinned down the design in which we can then proceed in ethics from. The Beatitudes, I would say, are subjected to the same issue. So there's a very interesting now twist that you introduced to the Beatitudes, Daniel, which is to say that there is a sense in which we can encounter the Beatitudes more, I'm going to use Heidegger's words, authentically when we realize that the design is incomplete. And that would have a real gesture in what it means to encounter the Beatitudes in their particularity. Because if not, what's happening is we're just repeating this presumption in which the design has already been set. We know what the design is, and then we're just proceeding from ethics. That is how it works. That's exactly how you laid it out, Daniel. Like, there's a sense in which we're already referring to design when we're acting from ethics. But is there a sense in which we can have Beatitudes where actually our encounter with the incompleteness of the design is from how we act from? So I guess my main point that I want to point to Luber, even though I'm not sure exactly how it implies, is this idea of a lot of what the secular globalist world can't think of is mercy and forgiveness. They can't actually think this. And the reason why they can't think this is because religion as such still continues to proceed from design to ethics, whereas the critique of the modern world is, well, the design is up to us human beings in a way, but they throw away the very things that make possible real reconciliation and real forgiveness to encounter difference. So what we have is this weird, like, to me, I was thinking about this today, actually, where I was like, I feel like if we want to even talk about sublation, to me, mercy and forgiveness are the only ways in which sublation is actually possible. I have, especially when we're talking about design and ethics in a kind of relation to each other, because there's a way in which you can have a mistake for the design, and forgiveness and mercy can come in to kind of remedy and have grace for that kind of mistake, right? Be able to encounter that difference in that mistake. And I think we are in such a world where what's more important actually is what I always call this, like, the after ethics, because mercy and forgiveness are kind of like, well, that's when you already messed up, right? Like, yeah. So I feel like what there's so much debate about what the ethics should be and how it's supposed to go based on design. But I think that just, to me, that's Jockin's whole argument of, like, we keep collapsing goodness with beauty. Whereas, like, to me, the after ethics is the real potential for beauty to emerge. I mean, just the fact that someone could forgive someone that doesn't deserve to be forgiven is really a quite memorable, astonishing, all kind of experience to see. Same thing with having mercy. So I really feel like, even though mercy and forgiveness are part of the ethics themselves, they seem to get thrown under this idea of, like, we can only do mercy and forgiveness if they're within the design that we already accept. Well, we're in that problem where nobody accepts the design from which we accept. So that means that actually it's the inverse. It means that actually mercy and forgiveness should be the very things that make possible for us to tolerate different designs, and for beauty to emerge. And if we allow beauty to emerge, then it can give us perhaps a direction in which can lead us to what is the correct design, so to speak. So yeah, those are my thoughts that Jockin kind of sparked up in me.
Well, I think after ethics is tremendous there. I really like that. And alas, gentlemen, I will have to go myself in a little bit because I have to do work in the morning. But I say that, and we'll be here 2 more hours because this has been very important. So for me, religion is about the non-rational. And if you lose the non-rational, you end up in Nash equilibria and your society dies. Forgiveness is non-rational. It is the non-rational thing without which you're screwed. Beauty is non-rational. It's the non-rational thing that you need or you're screwed. Religion always could introduce the non-rational, and now we don't have a way of introducing the non-rational, so we're stuck with techno-capital Cthulhu, as Mikey Downs has been putting it, of eating ourselves alive, right? And I think all of these, I think Mr. Jockin is correct that religion now is certainly about the beautiful. I think, like, perhaps there was a time where religion was about the good because the good was the non-rational for that historic moment. Then maybe the true was non-rational for that historic moment. But in my opinion, religion is on the side of the non-rational. And you could argue that without fidelity or commitment to a religion, you will end up in autonomous rationality. You won't have the non-rational. You'll thus get a suboptimal result and you're screwed. Like, that was the function of religion, is that I think we don't really appreciate, is that it kept you from ending up in game theory problems. I would argue forgiveness is a game theory problem. We have no way to deal with it now, so we're dead. The good collapsing into the beauty, that's always going to occur if you don't have the non-rational, so you're screwed, right? So the question becomes, how do you get people, can you get people to do the non-rational, like truly commit to the non-rational without a explicit religious commitment, right? Because the reason why is the non-rational will by definition seem like irrational to everyone else except you, because that's why I like the term non-rational. Some people talk about trans-rational. The reason why I prefer non-rational is because trans-rational sounds nice. It sounds transcendent, and your experience of it will be great. No, the non-rational feels very close to irrational. It's humiliating, embarrassing, and it feels terrible when you do it. That is, though, what gets you through rational impasses or Nash equilibria. It is not something that feels transcendent. It is something that feels stupid. Because it feels stupid to forgive someone who hurt you. It feels stupid to go after the beautiful, which seems to be evanescent and everyone's mocking you, right? So non-rational is, for me, an intentional language to try to bring out the subjective destitution that comes with doing that of which keeps society from falling apart. I would argue the Beatitudes are non-rational principles. You know, the meek is non-rational. The pure in heart, what? Why be pure in heart? Aren't you going to be taken advantage by power? Aren't some Machiavellian prince going to get you? Like, why would you do that? Humility? Are you kidding me? Have you not been to Achilles? Do you not know of Achilles, right? All of these are non-rational. And the key to these ethics, well, the secret is that the design you need to not end up in rational impasses entails non-rationality. Like, that's the issue. And so here's the problem. If a human designs something and then you have ethics, the ethics will always fall into game theory problems. Religion combined the ethical and the open with the design, and they brought it with non-rational, which kept it from falling into game theory problems. But of course, it ran the risk of fanaticism, because when you have the non-rational, it could become irrational and then be fanatical, right? Of course. But if you don't have the non-rational at all, you're doomed. It's only a matter of time. So the key, that you could put it like this. If you create design, if you separate design and ethics, you're doomed. You're going to have game theory problems. What it has to be is an apprehension of the design and ethical together, which is nous, right? And religion basically was creating rituals and conditions of the experience of that apprehension. When you apprehend, because basically when you're looking at the Beatitudes, there is some sort of suggestion that this is participating in a certain design, a certain way reality needs to be to avoid rational impasses. And I think it's kind of evidentially the case at this point, because look at the forgiveness problem, look at the fragmenting pluralism, look at what rationality without non-rationality gives you. It gives you quantity at the expense of quality. You get a repressed human being, a flattening. I think there is, in a way, we are seeing more more evidently, the consequences of not having the non-rational. So the problem is also, I would note this, if you can't, like, the weird thing about non-rationality is you kind of can't intend it, because if rationality chooses what it thinks is non-rational, then it's rationally concluded that's non-rational, and so it's not going to work, right? So this is another little secret, I think, a little funny thing. A lot of these ethics of religion came from apprehensions of religious prophets and figures. It's not like they got together one day and said, let's rationally create a society that's going to, not fall into Nash equilibria or whatever, right? They did not do that. They apprehended from experience and the world and religious faith and the prophets and, whatever we want to put it, these. If you were creating morals, would you honestly come up with the Beatitudes? Like, would you really do that if you were trying to be rational? Like, if you were trying to be an intellectual person, are these what you would come up with? You may think you would now, after swimming in these waters for thousands of years, but the Greeks thought this was nuts. They thought it was crazy, and because they were the truth. And we've talked about this before. There's something about the Athens is true, Jerusalem is good, and now we're in the age of beauty, right? Like this, you would not come up with these principles, but you would if you apprehended from in a position of nous that somehow this is part of a design that is able to avoid, social impasses that get you into all sorts of trouble, right? There is something about the Beatitudes that, for me, is tied to what Mr. Jockin has been saying about nous, because you just simply would not arrive at these rationally, if you will. And of course, you actually see, honestly, that these Beatitudes, there are many atheists who follow religious ethics, right? I mean, they believe in humility, but it doesn't save you from it doesn't save you from the rational impasses, because these attitudes have to be tied to some sort of life of apprehension, mystery, God breaking through, the beautiful. If these Beatitudes are not tied to that, then they become design principles separated from the way of life that apprehends, and you lose the design and the ethics. These become ethics fit into a secular design. These have to be, they have to follow from apprehensions of something, not be that you plug into a framework that you structure, or they stop having their nous potential. They stop leading to apprehensions. They stop leading to these experiences that get you through the rational impasses. And that's why this is what it's so tricky. Rationality cannot create non-rational things. Like, rationality cannot design the non-rational. It has to come upon the design of the non-rational. It has to experience it. It has to surprise you. Now, once it surprises you, you can then use rationality to design it. But what you can only do is design a space. You can't lay out principles. Rationality cannot lay out principles of non-rationality. It can design spaces of the possibility of the encounter of the non-rational or the ethical in the way we are describing it. But if the people in that space are not conditioned to receive it or to be changed by it, it won't do anything. It won't have that impact, right? And so the question is the following: will those people in that space be able to have that impact without a formal commitment to a particular religion? I would say without basically, I'll put my cards on the table, basically without the infrastructure, the social coordination mechanism that may be affording new encounters, surprises, and different things like that. No, you have to take a specific position that you can be seen as, and be in the presence of that. Now, maybe there are ways to take specific positions outside the purview of the major religions, but you must take a specific position on that of which could be seen as wrong and embarrassing. I think beauty can do that. I think lack can do that. I think trying to stand up for the humanities in an age that doesn't believe it and really attest to real stakes. But you have to take a stand. You do have to stand for something. But please note, standing for does not mean you aren't confused. Standing for does not mean you know everything. It means that you allow yourself to be seen as something. That seems to be what conditions you to be the kind of subject that can enter into a space that has been designed in the ways that we've had, where if you can have the apprehension of the nous, and thus be drawn toward the ecstasy, as we've described. But you must take that stand. Now, the next, well, does the stand mean you have to say in Christianity, believe the virgin birth or not? Eucharist, sacrament, like you could get into all those different details, right? I would say taking a stand is that is critical, like whatever that may be. Now, I'm not trying to be a relativist, because you don't relativize the humiliation. You don't relativize, you feel and experience the encounter of the other who sees you as something, right? That's not relative. That is very, very concrete. You must undergo that. If you do not undergo that, then the Beatitudes cannot be moved to something that is on the side of nous, and thus transformation of the subject toward beauty. All they can be is rational, nice ways to perhaps have a nice secular society that won't be able to deal with the problem of forgiveness, or that won't be able to find itself encountering a beauty that can actually lift it beyond its own ego. So one has to take those things. The details of that have to be brought out. But some sort of absolute choice, I think, is necessary. And by absolute choice, a certain commitment, a tying to an absolute. I should expand more on that, but I will stop and give it to Mr. Jockin.
Very good as always, Daniel. I think there's note from Javier and yourself, Daniel, about forgiveness and mercy. Yeah, so actually we know this. You know why I know this? Because, for example, I believe when South Africa basically became a democracy and they got rid of their segregation, it was very Christian. That move was very Christian. The Reconciliation Committee. Let's fast forward to now. There's basically it's very clear that they're rescinding on that model, because and that's because they're basically saying no. We need to. Mercy is and forgiveness, reconciliation is not on the table. Now we need justice. And that's the thing. In justice, it is correct. There were wrongs done to blacks in South Africa, and they were systematically persecuted, attacked, destroyed. And in justice, they have every right to reprimand, to do what they're doing now in South Africa. So really, that's the point. So when that mode of the initial reconciliation was very much in this relationship, I think the reason why this is important is because actually, Dan, you're totally correct that these first moments of apprehension of the non-rational are not reasonable. You have to encounter it, and it has to be revealed to you. But it does have the power of retroactive awareness. So what you hinted at, which is, this is why atheists that go, "Oh, you could be kind," they use kindness, right? That they have an empathy. I always notice that. So that only makes sense because they're in a society that's cognized on these non-rational principles, and now they make sense retroactively, which is again another example of the beautiful being converted into the good. So again, it's always this when Luber made a comment about not forgetting the mystery. This part I agree with him 100%. Is this issue of it's just so the mind is so good. It's so good of just forgetting what was once a completely incomprehensible impossibility or insanity or uselessness, right? All these things. But then once the principle is enacted and then we see the result, it becomes all rationally obvious. It's like, of course you would do that. Why wouldn't you be kind? Why would like that kind of stuff? So that's certainly why atheists can make an argument you can be moral without religion, because they're just relying on the normative, retroactive obviousness of what was once an insane impossibility. And that's why the Beatitudes are very important to reference about in the context of Greek culture. This was insane. This was not the way to go at all, in any sense. In fact, even the image of Jesus on the cross as their thing they pray to, this is insane. This is madness from their point of view. And that's the thing also, but besides like the points of humiliation, stupidity, uselessness, all this, patheticness, madness, just straight up madness, like all the way. Like it's just not rational. It's incomprehensible. So I think that's kind of what you can do retroactively as a way to model, talk about this, is that why, like, what will be a post-rationalization to explain why is mercy and forgiveness a very powerful metaphysical principle that gets you towards beauty, is because they open up possibilities that injustice you get cut off from. That's the argument. But that makes no. That's such a metaphysically complicated concept that you have to explain through. That only makes sense when you're in a certain relationship to able to explain that. That's actually a very important detail. And it's interesting because you can make retroactive analysis of Aristotle, for example, where this is there. This whole note about equity being the perfection of justice. There's a lot of commentators that say that's basically mercy. That's a discussion of mercy. And so, particularly in an Aristotelian account. To summarize what that means is that there's some kind of error to the universal rule that does not apply to this particular circumstance, and in an equity you adjust to respond to the particular circumstance. So that that sensitivity to the particular, a sense of a lack in response to the measure, and then that power of adjustment in response to it. That's one example. But that's also that's a limit. Even Aristotelian accounts have a limit to this nature of mercy. Most especially because you can't have friendship with God. That's Aristotle's account. So there you go. So you have to build on takes you to the limit of thought, the limit of what's possible in a certain account. And then it's also I remember, Javier, we talked about this in the net one time because you were just starting your catechism. And I think the group was basically discussing this, that basically the commitment is you're making a commitment to a doctrine, to a study, to a religion, and with an acknowledgement that's not going to have all the answers. You're going to put it. If you're someone who's intellectually honest, you're going to get to the limit of that account. And part of your maturity is realizing that. That's always a big problem when you're first getting into a belief system, or, by the way, some people take their philosophical practice as a religion. They get super excited. The Heidegger bros, they get like obsessed with this one person. I study this one person. It's going to be awesome. All my problems are going to be solved. I'll know everything. And then you realize, no, you don't. You won't know shit. For multiple reasons. It might be contradictions in the account, or it didn't cover certain topics that are relevant to the point, etc. You know, a whole bunch of points. Or that the model they present, when they actually stress test it to apply to different contexts or circumstances, it doesn't work. It really starts breaking under the pressure of the model of what he presented to you. And that's in philosophical projects, let alone a religious account. I mean, I'll tell you, as a Muslim looking over at Christians, especially Catholics and Orthodox, that Eucharist of yours is absolutely the critical linchpin moment. That's it. That's all. I mean, in my point of view, as a Muslim, I'm looking at that. That's the moment, because if that account is presented to you, it's real. That's the truth, and that's a whole demonstration. That's actually a really interesting point. Actually, the Eucharist for you all is exactly your biggest issue, in the sense that that's a miracle that's been obliterated from being a proper experiential miracle. It's supposed to be. If you actually believe what the doctrine is about, that from an Orthodox and Catholic perspective, that's really God in front of you. That's God happening, and you're eating God every day, every Sunday, being embraced with that. It's a huge deal.
Oh yeah.
The fact that Protestants, very, very in different degrees, obliterate that. That's even in the religion, let alone everyone on the outside. You know, I remember one of the stats. I think it's like only 20% of Catholics actually think the presence of the real presence is there. For example, so even Catholics themselves have this problem. American, like Western Catholics. That's where we're seeing. I'm just pointing this out to show that these impossibilities of limit of thought are really happening in different belief systems. They do happen, and it's. I don't know how to respond to that, but I just want to reflect on that part. And then, because the reality, the thing is that as we're saying, this techno-capital position, secular techno-capital position, has no room for forgiveness and mercy. It's not there. It's not built in, and we're going to get destroyed because it's going to cause a national equilibrium of purely rational justice, basically injustice collection. It's totally true. And we're going to fail because of that. So actually, ironically, we're under that circumstance, we're going to have, the religion has to have a role to play. Now, some people want to have a religion without religion. They want to do it that way. I think that's kind of like, I think I got to be honest, my stake in the ground is kind of related to Daniel's, is that kind of when I told the Luber, it's like, what are you loving? What's your devotional love to? I don't see how it's possible to do this unless you use something that would be that kind of devoted love. Maybe nature is a kind of pan-naturism, an orientation. People use like organic nature as one example of that. Maybe I think other times the self-ego. I think the reason why spiritualism seems to be very dubious because it aims to emphasize the self. So if the self becomes a thing you're devoted to, there's two problems. One is the problem is that, ironically, a self is actually very indefinite. There's a quote from Aquinas that we don't even know ourselves. Only God knows us. Because the problem is that we rely on our images to have a self-image. So self-esteem, self-enlightenment, that kind of thing. The Aquinas' point of view is that would be theoretically independent of God. That's impossible. Just because the operation of human beings, how we work, whether our contact with our souls is not direct. It's only possibly secondary. I think that's kind of. I find that tends to be like, there's a lot of discussion of this kind of post-God, post-religion discussion. I think there's, like I said, I think the question, stuff like this, it's just interesting because for me, my faith actually got stronger from from philosophical training. That's the thing. So, and I know it's irregular. But I'll know why, because I didn't go, I basically read over, modern philosophy from Descartes on. I read them, I know of them. But they're not my expertise. My area of study really intensely was on Plato and Aristotle. So it is interesting that by having their accounts, right, my religious understanding got much stronger.
Yep.
So maybe that's a worthwhile discussion part. that's a little difficult to talk about, right? Because I'm a little neutral about it. However, when I talk with other students, like students I've mentored in philosophy with this mode of topics, I've had conversations with them later about their faith being renewed and strengthened by the conversation.
Yep.
So I find that very optimistic in terms of maybe the best thing philosophy can do is get you in a grounding or an environment where it strengthens you to accept the possibility that this is a rationally reasonable proposition, which was natural theology, that's the entire purpose was to set up the environment where you can say with confidence in your understanding that yes, this is a reasonable proposition.
Yes.
Based on these lines of reasonings and arguments, and if I accept these premises, this conclusion is a very reasonable conclusion. I might not have full certainty about it, but I didn't know it's reasonable to go in this direction. Anyway, so those are my notes, at least in terms of like what can. Ironically, one way philosophy be the handmaiden of theology is that, or at least prepare people for that direction. But ideally, even if you don't have the purpose of theology justification argument made is life and beauty. Probably those two are probably the best options we have, since those are things that people. Life is actually that's something my research now and working for health. You realize how actually incredibly slipping life is. Life has exactly that kind of perplexing slippage. Every time you think you understand it, and you actually sit there and try to explain what actually life is, it just runs out of your hands. This is fast. Much like beauty works exactly the same way. Beauty does exactly the same. We think we know beauty. We're very confident we know what it is, and then when we actually try to acquire it and kind of get our hands around it, running out of your hands. So if philosophy can set up those groundings to justify that stance, go, no, this is a reasonable point. I consent that this is a reasonable move, and it's worth it. I may not fully understand it, but I have a certain framing for it or parameter around it, enclosure environment for it, opening for it. Then that's enough we can do for now in terms of what we at the current state of affairs. Just to answer Luber's original question about religion and the Beatitudes, because that's the point. The Beatitudes only made sense as a reversion of that current society at that time.
You know, it's interesting, right? Like, I have the same feeling-ish. I'm actually very confused. I'm very confused. But I definitely have some sentiments of what Jockin is talking about with, to what degree is philosophy going when they try to rework religion, and, like people like Caputo and all these other kind of movements. Because I do think there's a sense in which, if you go through Aristotle deeply and Plato deeply, there's a sense in which it's not a problem. Like, religion isn't really a problem per se. But then there's that sense of like my thrownness, like where I am currently, which I think poses a different obstacle to how we approach. And I think that's why I brought up the whole like, well, isn't it interesting that people are getting to poetry from people that don't even read poetry? So there's a sense in which you could say like there's people that are advocating for religion that don't really have like a strong basis in religion, but they're somehow making a movement to call back to it, which seems necessary. But then, well, I guess I'll put it like this. So my card on the table is, I think, Daniel, I had this conversation with you like, my God, like 2 years ago, 3 years ago now. I'm still like a perennialist, so to speak. But the problem that I realized with taking a perennialist position is, well, if you think all religions are true, well, then doesn't that kind of leave you in that position where you don't pick anything? Right? And then you're also in that weird position where, well, how can you really assert that they're all true if you don't really just go all the way in on one? Because that seems to be the actual fundamental argument for perennialism is actually, if you go all the way to the end with one, you would encounter the set difference that makes possible this idea of tolerating other religions, which is why it's fascinating that when the mystic goes all the way, he's not even bothered by the Catholic or the the Muslim or whatever. Why is it that it's such a case that it is that way? And then I realized, well, perennialism, accepting perennialism as a defensive position is kind of like abstractly pointless because it requires such a high stake of living in terms of like just actually choosing and actually going all the way through with it to even reach your conclusion. And the problem is, if I believe in what I believe, well, I might not actually even ever affirm my conclusion because, well, that assumes I reach the end and can see the difference in which they speak from, these mystics are speaking from. And of course, there's a lot of other problems, you know, interpretation of experience, you know, people have talked about this, but what's fascinating to me is this idea of meaning, because recently my girlfriend and I have gotten into reading poetry together. And the context of this is my girlfriend used to be an evangelical, hardcore evangelical, and she was broken spirited by religion because basically, in her conclusion now, it was a bunch of manipulation and you know, short circuiting affirmation. Right? There's a way in which religion can say to the people in it, "You're subjugated because we're true, because we are the truth. We are subjugated because we are the truth." So that there's that danger, and she's sort of traumatized by that. And then there was this question of like, well, what do we do? And I think this kind of alludes to Luber's question, like, well, what do we do when religion doesn't seem adequate, but it only doesn't seem adequate in the sense in which it kind of obscures the conditions at the current moment in which it can feel adequate to begin with. And this is what Jockin was pointing out with philosophy. My encounters with poetry, where my girlfriend is usually so stuck about trying to wring the meaning of something. Well, poetry is actually the perfect ground in which, well, wringing the meaning out of the poetry sort of sucks the whole kind of fun out of it. Where it's like, it's a part of the process, but it's sort of like always open, so to speak. And it was the only thing in which we could do where she didn't feel like there is a power dynamic in the situation. Right. So philosophy, because I've tried, you know, engaging her with some philosophy, for her, the dynamics always switch because, well, she knows that I've read more philosophy. So already the dynamic is, in her mind, skewed, even though, in my opinion, I'm still just as confused as when I began. But it's hard to relate that to someone when our confusion gets a little bit more sophisticated in exactly where the confusion lies. And I think that can be mistaken for me knowing more. The only thing I know is maybe where I can place the confusion maybe properly, right? Like, it's still a hard problem. So poetry then becomes this avenue where one can it's interesting because when you read poetry, they avail you to certain moments in which you don't really have a tendency to reflect from. Now, I don't, of course, think it quite answers like how do you get to an ethics from there, but it does seem to at least let you enter into this state of confusion and self-reflection as a possibility in which perhaps you can then wonder about your own condition. That's the only thing I think it could avail you to. I'll briefly end here. There was this poem that we read together today where the woman is describing colors and her outfit the whole way through. And you would think that she was actually kind of conceited because she's talking about her outfit so much. And then the poem ends and it talks about how she had to go through the weapons check. And you realize that actually she's hyper conscious of herself because she is in a particular outfit and she doesn't want to be arrested. And so the title of the poem gives this actual anxiety. The obsession with the outfit is actually the anxiety of being in the police station.
Hmm.
And that's why she's sort of relaying all the colors in which she's talking about the outfit. And then also how there's this one moment in the poem right towards the end where she says, my yellow skirt, whatever, meshed with the current colors of the station. And that was the alleviation of anxiety. What? Like, wow, who would ever thought that was possible? A certain color, a certain fixation would be the alleviation of momentary anxiety in which someone is in the police station. Well, I never thought that was possible. So that opened a very deep conversation about that with my girlfriend and I. So yeah, I mean, I there's a sense in which poetry helps you that we shouldn't wring the meaning out to death. Philosophy tells you, well, you have an understanding, but you haven't learned to articulate that yet, have you? No, we haven't learned to articulate anything. And then there's a sense in which Heidegger, I think he had great potential in realizing that the pre-ontological is where everything gets carried. The pre-ontological is actually where all the potential really is, I think, because for Heidegger, everything was predicated on, well, we actually really need an articulation of the ontological. But wait a second, there needs to be a pre-ontological first, which we're able to articulate from. So, yeah.
Wonderful. I'm not sure if you know how to be with someone until you learn to be with someone with a work of art. I think learning to be with a work of art is precisely learning to be with others. And without that learning, I'm not sure if ethics is possible. That seems to be the pre-ethical of the possibility of the ethical. And then, of course, if you can't be with someone in that way, you certainly could not be with them before beauty, and you certainly could not be with them through pain, and so on and so forth. Basically, if the problem of forgiveness is not addressed, we're doomed. That is the problem. It all will come down to that, because that determines if you're anti-fragile. And if you are incapable of forgiveness, then eventually on the time scale, the human breaks apart and the machine takes over. Because if you want an alternative to the machine, then you must be able to handle the social. And if you can't forgive, then the social is fragile. And so over long enough of a time scale, it eventually breaks, right? So it all comes down to the question of forgiveness. And it would seem to me as if forgiveness as a non-rational principle is that of which we will not stick to without a defined commitment. Like if you don't have a defined commitment that really means something to you, then when stuff hits the fan and it's time to actually do the non-rational, you'll give it up. You'll talk it up, but when the time comes, you leave, right? So you need a defined commitment. And the defined commitment can be defined to a definitive experience, because we've made distinctions between definite and definitive. The definition of a human versus the definitive character of Michelle. That becomes a partial object that then creates eros and attraction and beauty and bringing you in. There's something about making a defined commitment that then makes something definitive, which then makes it possibly infinite in its definitiveness, as a true infinity that you relate to, and thus can always be a generator of beauty. Basically, it does not seem probable to me that people will stick to the non-rational when it counts, unless the sticking of it to it is backed by a definitive experience, which seems to be only possible where there's a defined commitment. The defined leads to the definitive, which leads to the partial object that attracts into beauty, that makes you love it, like Mr. Jockin has said. So you cannot have eros serve the non-rational, if you will, or eros align with the non-rational, except through a defined commitment, which lead to a definitive experience that would attract you in, because you simply will not sustain the non-rational unless the beauty sustains you. Unless the beautiful attracts you and it fills you and you find joy in the sustaining of the non-rational. Well, how in the world would you do that? Well, because it is effused with beauty. right? And then there's a joy in martyrdom. There's a joy in pain. There's a joy in suffering at that point. That's the weird move that beauty can do. Beauty can make scars wonderful. Only, you could argue only beauty can do this. You could argue that only beauty can make pain good. Only beauty can make scars crowns. Only beauty can make suffering glory. I don't think goodness can, because goodness is the opposite of the pain. Beauty is what can actually make the scar turn into the good, right? Beauty can make the pain, and it is only when pain has the possibility of being flipped into life that forgiveness will occur. No one would engage in forgiveness if they didn't have some sort of belief or in the possibility of pain becoming life, or life coming through the pain, or somehow life being apprehended in pain. Well, beauty is the revelation of that possibility. And so unless you have a relation with beauty, it would not seem to occur. Oddly, what philosophy seems capable of doing is making something more defined. Like, philosophy is able to make the religion clearer. It is able to make it more defined in what it is doing and what it does. Before, maybe when you joined a religion at 5 or whatever, you know, you didn't really understand it. But philosophy can come along and make it defined. And in making defined, it can be definitive. And once it's definitive, you can, well, fall in love with it and be attracted by the arrows, right? And philosophy is seemingly at its best when it can make things definitive, which is distinct from making them material. Philosophy and making a thing definitive makes it time-space, not space-time, whereas pragmatism makes everything basically space-time, and it is not particular. It is expendable. That's the problem with pragmatism. Sure, you could say it gets to doesn't it make everything particular because there's only material things? Yes, it makes everything particular, but it is expendable and arbitrary in that particularness, whereas beauty makes everything a revelation in its particularness to a depth that is only accessible through a relationship to it, right? Beauty has a tracit of pragmatism and empiricism and materialism in it, but materialism becomes an unfolding of that of which is not reducible to one's immediate experience of, right? So these are where their small differences are a big deal. But it does seem as if beauty has, it does seem as if philosophy has some sort of making a thing definitive, some sort of making it clear, making it itself, right? But you see, this is odd because philosophy seems to do this through, instead of, well, utility, something more like metaphysics, something more like thinking, something like, isn't it odd that abstract thinking somehow makes things more themselves, right? This is a methodology that you would not naturally fall into. You would assume that utility, pragmatism, and science is how you get to know a thing, right? That's rational. The non-rational way to get to know concrete things is through abstract reasoning or conversations like this, that then you say, well, there's something about conversations like this that make me able to experience things when I walk to the mailbox. That doesn't make sense. That's not rational. It's non-rational. And you see also critically, again, I also think if you can get a society to do forgiveness, because it is non-rational, and religions could do this, it could teach you to forgive even if you didn't believe it. Well, once you take the step of doing something non-rational, you've taken a step toward metaphysics. Like, non-rationality leads you toward metaphysics quite naturally, because once you start believing that you need a logic beyond immediacy, well, you need a logic beyond immediacy, like the categories of physics themselves. So the non-rational naturally leads to the metaphysical. And then, of course, the metaphysical could lead to the non-rational. Like, again, philosophy and religion used to be very closely related. It is certainly possible that philosophy can lead to religion and religion to philosophy. Perhaps a point to Mr. Luber's, you know, what Luber is saying. Philosophy can't do this if you do it like we've mostly been taught to do philosophy. Like, philosophy would have to be serious. If philosophy is actually serious, then it could lead to the religious stand, the ultimate concern perhaps of a Tillich or something like that. But philosophy that is not so serious would not. And I don't see how philosophy, if you grant me this language of seriousness, and I will have to go, but this has just been too much fun. You know, I say, I don't know if philosophy can be serious without lack, life, and beauty, to use the terms that Mr. Jockin has put forth. I believe basically it will not be serious unless it doesn't take those things seriously. I would like just quickly, because Mr. Luber did note the repetition, and that there's a certain repetition that seems important, you know, the repetition. Well, first off, are not religions often repetitive? That's interesting. There's something repetitive to religions. Of course, we learn from Hume or Deleuze or different people and Hegel is that no repetition is a repetition. There's always an excess. If you do it again, there's something new. Perhaps nous is the grasping of the new of repetition. Perhaps that is the apprehension where you repeat, you repeat, you repeat. And because you repeat, suddenly there's a difference that you had to apprehend that you wouldn't have noticed because you thought it was just a repetition. The excess that appears in sameness might have something to do with nous, because there's something there that is not there at the same time, right? The repetition of life unveils that, there's something beyond the material causation. The excess of repetition perhaps is what nous grasps. And that is also, well, what religions, I think, Alston, can train you. Like, you did this a million times, and isn't it odd that there's something different in the millionth time, right? Once you grasp the excess of repetition, then you grasp the possibility of something being there that's not there, present in its absence like lack, and then you've also grasped the possibility of reality being more unfolding, temporal than spatial. Well, once you grasp all of this, well, then you can orient and change your life accordingly. And once you do that, the way life unfolds, because will change accordingly, because you are changing the relation by which life unfolds in that disposition, right? And I think that too suggests the unique human intelligence, perhaps distinct from an AI, is that you do have this capacity to seemingly grasp an excess of a repetition, where a machine simply repeats. The problem with the machine is it repeats perfectly, perhaps. The machine repeats perfectly, whereas the human in the repetition has an excess, where the repetition always entails a bit of newness that can be apprehended and then calibrated according to. And I think in religions being so repetitive, they naturally, conditioned you to the openness of that repetition, but not when they lost beauty, because then they moralized the repetition as an end in itself and actually became antagonistic to the excess that might be apprehended from the repetition. And then perhaps religions became problematic. I will pause and give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
Just to build on what you're saying, this whole point of ritual, right? Ritual is the repetition. It orients the body for the religious experience, and then the mind and the soul from that. So just to build on that part. And exactly, the problem is when the you can say that also because when you think about it, any of us here who has a religious practice, there's definitely times when you're in the mode, sometimes you're not. And actually, it was very important, actually, I know for myself, my prayers and whatnot, there's that distance. When I sense the difference, the dissonance of, I could, like, basically the mind, I'm not oriented, I'm trying to be oriented, but I'm not. It's like when you're angry and you're trying, it's like you feel this push that gets you in a certain way. So these are examples of the same repetition revealing some things about you, right? As in that example, just on that particular part, let alone the religious experience of apprehending God differently, or relating to God differently. Which, right, the orientation of the body related to that, because think about that. It's a good example of it. It would be in certain positions of our body at certain times, at certain places. We say certain words. We have certain sounds. We have certain clothing put on in those circumstances, and then the soul getting oriented to from that. Yes, and I think you know about the nous being the apprehension of the excess in the same from repetitional sameness. Yes, totally agree with that. But I do like this kind of generation of lack, life, and beauty.
Yep.
These are interesting kind of three pillars or reference points or signs that I think are very, very, very interesting. Because life is relatively new. I mean, that's more my recent research that I've brought to that point. I think it's really worthwhile. That's all I have on my side.
Well, I've enjoyed this immensely, and I think basically when we can sort of see that there's a human capacity to apprehend that of which seems to be beyond the immediacy, that brings with it a sense of design and ethics together, thematic, that then invites a certain participation in that which is open, we start bringing together ways, especially when we orbit life, lack, and beauty, to deal with this problem of agent and nature. At another time, I should get more into the absolute choice and how I do think nature, I think the world brings you to the place where you have to make an absolute choice. But then the reason you're brought to that is because nature is such that this is required. And also because there seems to be something in nature that wants to invite you to participate in it, with a choice of four. It's like choosing a lover, but that choice is actually a commitment to the definitiveness, and thus the possibility of eros and different things like that. But the key, what you brought up, Mr. Jockin, on eros cannot be overstated. This is extremely important. Gentlemen, I've enjoyed this a lot. I don't know where the time goes. It was erotic, right? You know, excessive erotic, bringing us into beauty in the way that was meant for the love that moves the sun and other stars. The proper fittingness of eros with beauty. So thank you both.